Association.
You said Robert there for a second.
Diana Plotkin, President, Beverly Wilshire Homes Association.
Jeff Highland, Truesdale Homeowners Association.
Gilbert South, Westwood Homeowners Association.
Barbara Norman, Jessica Marshes from Council District 11, Bel Air Skycrest Property Owners Association.
I'm Tom Burns, I'm a guest of Shannon, who's from Overland Avenue Community Homeowners Association Coalition.
Shannon Burns, Overland Avenue Community.
Robin Greenberg, Roscommon Valley, and Bella Beverly Preston, County Council Outreach Chair, and BRAC.
Arlene Morris, Long Creek Condominium Association.
Michael Malone, Track 7260 Association.
Lucy Bobbitt, Chevy Hills Driving Safety Association.
Okay, great. So thank you all for coming again. I want to, before we actually start, I want to congratulate Diana Plotkin. Woo! She got elected to the Democratic County Commission so, for the 95th year or something.
Of its existence, not of your existence, don't worry.
There you go.
I mean, the fact that Diana keeps getting reelected, she demonstrates, you know, the quality of the work that she does for the Democratic Party. So, thank you. Although I'm not saying whether I'm a Democrat or Republican or independent, but thank you because it's public service.
Yes.
And that's all. Always public service is always appreciated. So, Irene isn't here. I don't know if that's her. Yep. Okay. So Irene Sandler's coming. She'll take the minutes. So I'm thanking her in advance of her entry.
Pre-approved, thank you.
We're going to get started so we can finish on time. You know how I like to finish on time. So Eric, we're glad you're here. We've had your fellow candidates. You're our final candidate for this part of our process. The process that we go through is that after this kind of introductory meeting, because we really don't know you,
Sure.
Maybe some people know you, but I think the group as a whole doesn't know you. We have interviews, individual interviews with each of the candidates, and we do that in the summer. Would you be willing to do that?
Of course.
Oh, good. Here are the dates to
All right,
choose
good.
from.
I'm very well trained as not to circle one without going to my schedule first, but I will make sure that we get one.
Okay.
I'll make sure you.
You know, I can call that.
Okay,
scheduler.
let me give you her email.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And then in the fall, we will do a forum with all the candidates together.
Great.
Okay? You would be willing to do that?
Absolutely.
Okay, fabulicious. Okay, so I have that commitment. You've all heard it. I want to thank Mike Ebeloff for filming this so that we now really have it.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so we'd like to start. Eric, if you want to take, 5-10 minutes.
Okay.
Say whatever you want to say, and then we'll get into the questions. This is Wolfgang White from North Westwood.
Big Ben, Steve Shank.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Well, thank you, Marcia. Thank you to the coalition. I really appreciate everybody starting your Saturday here and beginning the weekend when you could be relaxing, instead engaging, which is a lost art, but I don't have to tell this group that has defined what engagement means in the city, that it is critically important that we do that in a city and in a country where this is the exception now instead of the rule, where politics passes as turning on whatever your political stripe, Fox or MSNBC, and watching people shout instead of people talk. I think it was Rousseau who said that the only democracy that matters is enough people that could sit around a tree and still see each other's faces. So I think we've got just about that right here. And I want to thank you for your activism in preserving Los Angeles and making sure that we maintain a road towards what's right, to be able to hold back that which is wrong. And it very much feels like coming home here. My cousins, the Roths lived on Roscommon Road, so I grew up on, getting lost in the hills here. It wasn't I, but my sister and cousins who had to be airlifted out once by LAFD when they walked too far down towards the reservoir. But I did plays here over at Westlake. My family, we actually almost moved to Angelo Drive here. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, but my sophomore year we almost moved here. Instead, wound up going to Brentwood my senior year of high school. So West Los Angeles and this area in particular very much feels like home. It's great to be with so many folks who represent the unique and yet common neighborhoods of this area. And the best part about running for mayor is being able to try to connect the different pieces of such a disparate city, these villages that we each contain and pour our lives and our dreams into, but also trying to figure out what the commonality is. In other words, how do we keep the uniqueness and the beauty of each place and actually figure out a way in certain places to unleash that even more? And then at the same time, what do we do to call ourselves a city? So let me give you a little bit of my background so you can understand the city that I grew up in and I think the values that we hold together. I'm a fourth generation Angelino, depending on how you count generations, but my great-grandfather came here when he was about 6 or 7 on my mother's side. I'm an average Angelino in the sense that none of us are. I have an Italian last name. I'm half Mexican, half Jewish by heritage. Both sides of my family came here fleeing war in the early part of last century. On my father's side, the Mexican Revolution, my great-grandfather lost his life in the same, he was a judge, we think, and he lost his life in the same town where Pancho Villa was assassinated. My great-grandmother carried my grandfather literally over the border in her arms and settled in Boyle Heights here when he was 1 year old. My mom's side of the family came from Russia and Poland, Eastern Europe. They fled the Russo-Japanese War when Jews were being conscripted against their will by the Russian Empire, and they also settled in Boyle Heights. And I like that they didn't know each other, but they both settled in the same neighborhood. It's predominantly, of course, a Latino area now, but you can see evidence that Jews once lived there because there's pastrami at all the taco stands still on Cesar Chavez Avenue, which used to be Brooklyn Avenue. But this was incredibly fertile ground. They left fleeing something, but they found something bigger than they ever could have dreamed. On my dad's side, Salvador, who I mentioned to you, if it were today, he would have been classified as a kind of classic at-risk youth. He didn't finish junior high school, didn't grow up with a father around. We used to spend the weekends at my grandparents' house growing up, and I remember one weekend watching television, seeing this very distinguished African-American gentleman, and my grandfather said, "Oh, that's the mayor of the city, Tom Bradley, I know him." And I was so impressed because a lot of people think I grew up in politics. My father didn't run for DA till I was out of college, and so we were just an anonymous family here, but my grandfather knew the mayor. He said, "How do you know Mayor Bradley, Grandpa?" And he said, "Well, when I was younger, he arrested me." So we've been destined to intersect with mayoral politics, but he turned his life around. He met my grandmother. He fought in World War II, wore this nation's uniform, and became a citizen, and came back here and opened a small barber shop and spent the rest of his life as a barber. And the barber shop was right around the corner from USC, where professors used to come after work and get their hair cut. And my dad, growing up and raised in South Los Angeles, learned about college. Became the first in his family to go there, studied hard, graduated from Washington High School, and got a scholarship to USC. My first job coming to, back to LA after my graduate work was as a professor at USC. So, this is the kind of town where 2 generations later I could be the professor that used to sit in my grandfather's chair. Now, for all you UCLA fans, don't worry, I went to elementary school just down the street here at UES, now the lab school, so I'm a Bruin at heart, as well. But I, on my mother's side, it's equally, well, my dad is the perfect one. He went to SC undergrad and then UCLA Law School, so he raised me rooting for UCLA basketball and USC football. Call me crazy. My mother's side of the family is equally kind of as inspirational to me. My grandfather, who was born here, met my grandmother when they both were piano students at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. They both were from here. They'd never met, grew up blocks away from each other in Boyle Heights, but were training to become classical pianists. Returned here, and my grandfather used to play at the Silent Movie Theater on Fairfax, and he decided there wasn't a lot of money in music, so he took up his father's trade as a tailor. And he started a clothing company named after my great-grandfather, Louis Roth Clothes, which became one of the finest men's suits in the country. And one of his customers was Jack Valenti, and after President Kennedy was assassinated and President Johnson was sworn in, he tapped Valenti, and the first thing Valenti did when he got to D.C. is he looked at Johnson. He said, "You're the President of the United States now, but you look like a schlub. I know this guy out in L.A. who makes a really nice suit." And my grandfather became tailored to the President of the United States, a generation after his father's here. So I tell about those stories because to me, and I'll wrap up the intro, that's what this city means to me. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley where there was kind of a limitless expanse of what the city was about, that you pour your dreams into this, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter who you are, you could find a safe, sustainable neighborhood, a great place with good schools. And I really am running for mayor because I want to return to those values, that connection, that closeness, that feeling that I had growing up, that feeling of possibility which is eroded from this city. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come before you, and I seek to be mayor not just because of where I've come from, but also where I want the city to go. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, so I appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. Very nicely said, and we appreciate that you have a nice and colorful heritage here in Los Angeles. I think one of the things that you said that captured my attention was your quote from Rousseau, that it's important to be able to see the people that you're working with and representing. So does this mean that you would be in favor of expanding the city council? Because right now, each councilman has their own fiefdom of 250,000 constituents, and it's impossible to know. So what happens under that circumstance is the special interest takeover. So would you, this is a yes or no question,
I have always been.
so how would you as mayor help create a larger city council?
Well, I'm also a realist that I don't believe that voters will ever vote for more politicians. But even if you said this, we spend X million dollars on all the city council offices and we won't expand it $1, or we'll even reduce it by 10%, but expand the number that share that pool, voters have pretty consistently shown that they don't want that. But I will, whenever asked, whenever it comes up, make that case that I do believe we're the largest city council districts in the country. And because of that 250,000 people, they're essentially cities unto themselves. That whatever we can do to continue to drive a more locally based interaction. And I've done that myself.
So would you be in favor of the borough system?
I'm not sure that the borough system wouldn't necessarily add an extra layer of bureaucracy. I've been open to looking at it. I've had a lot of discussions with Bob Hertzberg about it and push that forward. But I've also seen its shortcomings in New York as well, where that becomes an uber fiefdom. And that would be the last thing we want to see is even further disconnection between people and that level where suddenly, if all the land use authority suddenly went through a borough.
So what do you propose?
Well, I'll tell you what I've done and what I would do as mayor. For me, it's not just the formal structures. It's also what role a council member or mayor plays in actually teaching people and opening up the gates of government. I've tried to make my district an example of accessible and accountable government. So as soon as I got there, I hired community organizers that started something called the Neighborhood Leadership Institute. In my district of 250,000 people, we've graduated more than 1,000 activists now who have learned how a law gets passed in City Hall, how you can organize an association, how you can understand zoning. We developed something called Planning 101, which is now taught around the city by the planning department, which, when people come in, most Angelinos, to C3 versus an R2 versus, a mixed use zone, people don't know. And when I started doing this, a lot of people said, wait a second, aren't you worried these folks are going to organize against you? And I said, well, of course they are sometimes. Hopefully we'll agree on all things, but we never agree 100% of the time. But either you want the position, the title, and the power, or you do believe in grassroots democracy. You're a small d Democrat, party affiliation aside, or not. And so as mayor, I've already started doing this citywide, with co-sponsoring with a number of different associations, consulates, other people who haven't been a part of the system. We can't have, in a city of 4 million people, a few handfuls of folks be involved and expect for any of our work to be very successful. So I would build that, I think, in that structure. I've been somebody who's looked at the association, the neighborhood level, looked closely at community boards, for instance, in New York City, where planning and land use does go through the neighborhood level, not just a uber neighborhood level, where it can be more the special interests, it can be more the campaign donors and all of that. I think that something like that we should be very open to. And lastly, I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be judged. You can, let's say we took the same amount of money and cut it up into smaller pieces. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have better representation because, I keep myself very open and accessible. I've never stopped walking after I got elected. Once a month, I go with a couple dozen people. We just did it last weekend. And I go door to door proactively in my district. I've done that now, I don't know, nearly 100 times since I've been elected. Every 2 weeks, I just had it yesterday, I have office hours where people don't need to be vetted by anybody. They line up and they come and they can meet with me, directly with me.
So
and I would continue that as mayor.
Are you saying that you really listen to your constituents?
If I don't, this is what I love about local government. It is the most accountable level. I will have a grandmother who comes up to me at the grocery store when I'm in sweats coming back from the gym, telling me why isn't my stop sign there. That happens in absolutely As mayor, I think one of the problems we've had is the bubble. You know, the further you go up in politics, sometimes the bubble becomes bigger and bigger. For me, I would continue office hours, I'd continue doing walking.
So
and I would
that's
make sure
your
that they're
accessibility.
Yeah.
But accessibility and listening are actually two different things.
No, no,
So here we have, as an example, the Hollywood Community Plan. We always try and be prepared.
Good.
And so we have your community, this is not our community, but we have the same issues, and you know, it all starts from the top, that you are supporting development, and I have 10 of these. Have you seen this?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
This
I only have 10, so you have to share.
I oppose. This, if I wanted to get built, I could have in the last 11 years if that was my vision of Hollywood. This can't get done in the current community plan and won't get done in the next community plan.
Okay, but the community plan is, there's a lot of contentiousness over the Hollywood
Absolutely.
community plan. Lucy, do you have some comments about
No,
this?
I-
Yeah, Mike.
So the fire department is in the news.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came out of the controller's report and the independent auditor's report is that the data, the way that the data is collected, cannot yield valuable information. No one really knows the state of the fire department. I think one of your colleagues said garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
So if you don't know the state of the baseline of the fire department, how can you make a decision whether the area can withstand more development?
Well, let me talk. Can I talk about the fire department's data first, and then I know you link these two things together, and then I'll bring it to that. You know, last year I was the strongest voice in the council, and I actually fought back successfully the plan in the budget that was given to us to permanently cut 318, I think, positions. I said 314, 318 positions that would have permanently eliminated those from the fire department. And I not only was able to make sure that we didn't eliminate those positions, I established a new account in our budget that put any savings, any new revenues, it would go directly first and foremost in the fire department. The colleague who said garbage in, garbage out is my seatmate, Mitch Englander, and he and I introduced a motion to create something called Fire Stat, because I'm done and I don't trust the fire department anymore. They sold a lot of us last year a bill of goods, and I don't know if it came from them or from higher up, but they basically said, trust us, we can make certain cuts and look at the projections, you're going to actually have better response times. Now, in certain areas there are, but certain areas there aren't. And they didn't look in a very nuanced way about things like the traffic west of the 405 with the construction going on, what that would mean in rush hour when, you know, my wife and I co-emceed something at the Skirball Center a couple weeks ago. I was going from Hollywood, it took me 35 minutes. She came from Westgate and Sunset, which is essentially right there at Barrington. It took her an hour and a half. So, you know, when we're looking at life safety issues, those have to be non-negotiable. And this year, it was in the budget, if you see in the clips in the LA Times, it was my motion that got passed successfully, not just for a year of some restorations, but 5 years of restorations to go back to at least the level, if not beyond the level when the fire department proposed these cuts to us, first and foremost. Linking it back to here, we just opened Fire Station 82 last weekend. It's a beautiful fire station. It's only a 3-story fire station in the city of LA. It's right where the 101 and Hollywood Boulevard meet each other. It was built because of Proposition Q. Gorgeous, something that, you know, right now, if you look around, you can go from Fire Station 27 or 82, which are on the kind of two ends of Hollywood right now, and have quicker access, better, you know, we have full fire station ambulance as well as engine companies. And to me, that was very important for me. I've worked like 10 years on that because, you know, in Hollywood, we've actually, and part of the thing that bothered me about what we've seen so far in the Hollywood Community Plan, and to your question, I didn't write the community plan, and I will amend the community plan in defense of my community where I need to do that. I mean, I'm not going to just do something. There's a lot of great stuff in it right now. For instance, our community plan in Hollywood is from 1988. If we were to freeze frame probably the worst year in Hollywood's history, when there was open air prostitution on Sunset Boulevard and drug dealing footsteps from the Walk of Fame on Yucca, it would be 1988 when there was shuttered storefronts, when it was a really horrible place. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce did a study in the late 80s in Hollywood. The average tourist stayed there for 23 minutes. #1 tourist destination in America. And they came to Chinese Theater, took a picture, looked this way, looked that way, and got the heck out of there.
Okay, so,
Well, if I can follow up for a little
okay,
bit.
go ahead, Mike.
Okay. So on the response time percentages, the time that the response time percentages actually changed was between 06, 07. That's when it was reported at 66%, it jumped to 86%, and nobody looked at it.
Well, it's partially a shift of the standard that they were using to cause that.
Actually, it wasn't. But we
The
can talk-
06, okay, yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about
I mean,
that.
that's the 07, 08.
So, let me get back to the baseline
Sure.
question, if I can.
Sure, of course.
So, if you don't know the state of the fire department,
Yeah.
even with 82 coming in, and all resources are shared, so just putting one resource in one place,
Sure, sure.
they're all shared. So, how do you make a decision that the city can withstand more development if you don't know the current state of your fire department?
I would agree with you. The only way you can have it is with stats that we know, which is why we want to develop fire stat, just like CompStat exists for the police. Secondly, planning on changes to planning and zoning. For instance, in Hollywood right now, there are areas that are completely, you see spot zoning where you have a huge apartment building next to a single family home next to another apartment building. If we don't pass something to change that, we are defenseless today in Hollywood. We have historical elements that right now we are defenseless to preserve today. And so the need to update a community plan, I was told when I came in 11 years ago, it was the last plan to be done in the city. Don't worry, we're going to update the Hollywood community plan the next year or two. It's taken the planning department 11 years. Politically, the easiest thing for me to do would say, okay, forget this, keep it as it is. But that would be derelict duty for my own constituents if we don't have that sort of an update. When we're looking at, one of the things with a community plan is we kind of pour too much of the city's problems in just a community plan. For instance, I had folks telling me, where's the section on the number of police officers we need? Well, it is a zoning. Maybe
Okay, but
it's
can you answer Mike's question? How do you
I agree with it. You
do
can't-
development when you don't have the baseline information? Let's kind of
Right.
get to the core here.
Well, you look at response times, but we need to make sure those response times are accurate.
But if you don't know what they are, how do you make the
Well,
judgment?
we do now know what they are. I mean, the ones that they're giving to us in certain areas, and there's where we don't. That's why I'm
Okay.
taking the lead in developing what fire stat is. So I
Okay,
agree
so,
with you on that.
so first of all, I have one question.
Sure.
Okay, so you've been on city council for almost 12 years. So are you
Almost 11.
almost 11. So are you telling us that it's only within the past 8 to 12, 15 months that suddenly you realize the data's not accurate?
There's a piece of that yes is correct, because for a number of years, when the response times, I think people were not only satisfied with them, but were saying they're coming in, nobody questioned them.
So it took a death.
No, it did not take a death. It took us looking at what was happening with the cuts this year.
It took Mike writing a memo, 28-page.
Well,
It took a chief coming to me and saying, I'm going to cut your fire station, but your response times are going to get better.
Right.
That's what it took.
And that's what it took with us too. It took us at a moment when we had the fire department come to us and say, trust us. And we've had great relations. We've had great leadership in the fire department in general. So, with almost 45 city departments, whether you're able to go in every single time and say, well, I don't believe that what you're saying about paving that street is actually true. We don't have the capacity. You want to talk about expanding the city council, we need to have probably 150 city council members to be able to have that level of granularity. So in trusting leadership, I was as disappointed and as let down. There's responsibility, but it's how we act when we find
So
out.
is it not a cultural problem? Because we as residents have known for a long time that City Hall is corrupt, that the information is bad, that they tell us what they want us to hear, not necessarily what the truth is.
Well,
How come we knew that and you guys didn't?
Look, we know that more intimately, I think, than anybody because we deal. You guys probably work almost what feels like a full-time job doing this. We do work 7 days a week. We do work 18-hour days. I do work at, I come from a family.
Okay.
No, if you're going to say that, let me just say that as well. We do know where the problems are, but corruption and problems we shouldn't always make those one and the same. We can talk about corruption as corruption. I grew up in a household of a prosecutor who was in charge of not only corruption, but went after public officials who were corrupt. My father headed up the Special Investigations Division of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, and I grew up with those stories around the table. I know that intimately. I'm a sworn naval officer. I took an oath for this position. I take that stuff extremely seriously, and I do know those things. But problems to solve and corruption, let's talk about each of them. I know there's a lot of things in the questions that you very kindly told me a little bit about before here, but I want to keep on track with each one. If we want to jump to the general discussion about corruption, absolutely we can go there. But to finish, I think, the fire department, because you do deserve a good answer to that, we can't, like any of the problems that we face, we cannot do that until there's good data. We have not seen leadership to bring about that data inside the fire department. Between us, that has been a failure of the fire department leadership. I'm not the mayor right now. But what I will do from my legislative position is make sure that as soon as we hear about that, as soon as we know about that, because response times, we've saved thousands of lives in my district. I know those stories. I hold mothers who have lost their child to a shooting. I am with somebody after they've had a heart attack in the hospital. I know that in the most intimate way. That's what this job is about. But at the end of the day, when we're sold a bill of goods a year and a half ago that response times are going to go down based on their computer system, and it's shown not to be right, we're going to leap into action, and we do.
So two things. First of all, you may all see this. This is
Yeah, I have
a
that
picture. Yeah, you have it.
Yeah.
So that's a picture of the board in the EOC
Yep.
showing, I'm sure you've seen it.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
And that was a very slow time. Red means there were 0 rescues available. I think 82 is one of those.
Right.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, when you talk about statistics, having looked into this in some detail, this problem has existed for years. Statistics were reported, I'm going to say effectively correctly, mostly within maybe 5 to 10 points as opposed to 20 to 30 points, until 06, 07, when they jumped from 66% to 86% in the consolidated performance report. And nobody
They went from 86% within or down to 68?
It was from 66% within 5 minutes
Okay,
to
so
86%
within the 5 minutes.
within 5 minutes without any increase in budget. And nobody noticed one of the 2 key public safety metrics changed by 20% with no explanation. That was 06, 07 before they got their new software.
Well, let me tell you a very important value of mine. If you want to know what kind of a mayor I'm going to be, one of the things we don't have in the city of Los Angeles right now is a chief information officer. We do a lousy job across all departments of collecting and sharing information. I want to be the first kind of high-tech mayor that the city has had. We are easily 20 years behind private sector, even nonprofit sector. We don't have a chief technology officer in the city of Los Angeles. For a $10 billion enterprise, we don't have a chief technology officer. I understand and get technology. I've looked at this and studied it. One of the things that's going to be important is not just, forget if it's the fire department for a second, say it's the police department next year, that we learn underneath all of our noses until you dig in and I dig in and we see this. All these years they were shading the crime statistics or something. The best way is to bring sunlight to all of that. I would have a chief information officer as the mayor of the city of Los Angeles who would share the data, whether it's planning data, Department of Transportation data, fire data, police data, with all of us. And when we have that, you then begin to be able to see whether it's the media, whether it's homeowner associations, whether it's us as council members, the ability to begin to know everything that's going on. I would like to see a dashboard as mayor when I wake up in the morning that says, the trash stats, the fire stats, the police and crime stats, but we don't have that right now. We're flying blind.
Okay, I got it. So we have a lawsuit right now against the city to force the city to do the annual report on growth and infrastructure, which is your dashboard.
I know, right?
And the city has said, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So how do those two mesh?
Well, as mayor, I'd love to work with you to see can we figure out a way to settle that and
I
actually do
think
it.
the question is, why haven't you done it? You were president of
required
city
by law.
council. Yeah.
Right now, the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, with the departments that he heads and has the power to head, is the person who exercises executive power over that. I would love that, and if we've been on parallel tracks trying to develop that, then let's start from this moment forward figuring out how we can do that.
But if that's the law, and it is the law,
Yeah.
you haven't done one since 1998.
Yeah.
It's
2001.
required, 2001.
The general plan
Couple
update,
years.
yeah.
Is it not your job as a member of the city council to say to the mayor and your president of the city council, say, wait a minute, how can we add one more building, that one, or any other one?
And just to be
Take
clear,
Century City,
I'm not
okay.
adding this building, won't
Any,
add this building,
any,
oppose this building.
any
'Cause I know
building.
everybody has it.
No, but any building,
Sure.
whether you're talking
Because you
about
voted for a lot of
whether you talk,
development.
you talk
Yeah.
about the Expo line, they haven't done half of the studies that they should be doing and how that's going to impact the city traffic-wise, fire response time-wise, anything. When this infrastructure law is on the books, you as a public official, it seems to me, and all other 14 members of the city council have a responsibility to me as a person that could have a stroke and there's no ambulance to come. You have a responsibility to enforce this law before you build a gas station, before you build anything.
Okay.
And we haven't been able to get an answer from anybody about this.
Well, I can tell you, we can talk about history, we can talk about what I'll do as mayor. I mean, there's both fair questions. If you say, why hasn't this been done, I can't correct anything in the past, but I'll tell you what I've focused on in my own district, which is to make sure that infrastructure is addressed. For me, it's not just the plan, it's actually saving someone's life. We're having the parks and green space. We're making sure that there are schools in an area. And please, I know, just stick with me for a second to let you know, so I can diagnose where we were 11 years ago, and then let me just paint a picture. In my own district where I have the most power to do something, I came in there and couldn't agree with you more. That was the problem. We had 50% of the children going to school outside their own neighborhoods because we hadn't built schools. Instead, it was cheaper someplace far away, and freeways didn't have any traffic, stick them on a bus and do that. We didn't build any parks because everybody had a backyard. It was LA. We took the Olmsted Brothers plan for a great park plan like New York had, and we shelved it away because everybody had that. It was okay when public transit fell apart because, this whole road system worked at one point, and the freeways were a quick way to get around. Suddenly, I'm looking at 2001, Council District 13, in which we had 13 parks for 250,000 people. 50% of the kids not going to school in their own neighborhood if they wanted to. A place where there was very little transit links, etc. 11 years later, what I've focused on for that stuff is, the building of, 2 police stations. I've focused on the building of a number of new libraries. We've taken those 13 parks, and I just opened my 38th park. We're going to have more than 40. Half the parks that were built in the city were built in a single council district of 15, because absolutely the focus was on, I'm not wanting to see things moving forward if we don't have parks for those people to play in, if we don't have libraries for them to go to, if we don't have schools for them to walk to in the neighborhood. 100% of the kids now go to school if they want to, inside their own neighborhood. We put an after-school program in each one of those, even though it's not the responsibility of the city of LA. That's supposed to be the school's problem, but of course it is.
Eric,
so looking at
I
the
don't-
infrastructure.
I don't think you've
just to sum
answered
up-
our question.
I am answering. Just so in terms of bringing those things together, when we look at infrastructure, the most important thing to do is actually to build the infrastructure. Plans are great. Plans can be wonderful, and they can help guide us. But the proof in the pudding for, I think, who I'm going to be as mayor is to actually do the infrastructure itself. I don't think you want a piece of paper. You want to make sure there's an ambulance, correct?
Okay.
Well,
And so-
but here's,
So-
I am a
so-
CIO for a company, and one of the key things that I do is I create metrics.
Right.
And in any company, you have metrics, and you
Yep.
see if you hit them,
Yep.
then that's how you determine success. So what we have here is building parks or building of this or building of that without the metrics.
I'm very metrics driven.
So
With all due respect, I didn't get to finish, and we have our metrics driven. I mean, take graffiti, for instance, which was something important. That's exactly the kind of leader that I am. I looked at, I said, graffiti is everywhere in this district. I don't want to just say, hey, we have a new program, pat myself on the back. That's the typical political thing. Aren't I a great leader? I said, we're going to go out there, and we're taking an entire day off, and 22 people who work for my staff got very car sick, counting every single graffiti tag on every block of every street of every neighborhood in my district. 1 year, 2005, when baseline is 20,754 tags. I set the metric of reducing that by 50%. And I set up a system of engaging now 400 block captains. I said, the old model of being an activist, which many of you have been, of one person for an entire neighborhood, being in charge of the whole neighborhood, doing it for a number of years, feeling like nobody else is helping and burning out, wasn't sustainable. So I said, if you want to be a block captain, you literally cannot tell us about graffiti on the next block. I need you to find somebody else. So 400 people now call it in. And then we go out there and count it every single year. We make that public. We invite the press to come to it. We've reduced graffiti by 86% over the last number of years. Chief Bratton, who I just saw in New York, said to me, he said, I could literally tell when I drove across the street from your district into one of your neighbors' districts. So I am a metrics-driven person. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, to get to the core of what you asked, with that specific lawsuit and with whether or not we'll have that, I would love, as mayor, to bring the resources into the planning department to finally make sure that we do that. We are flying blind, and I agree with you. Why haven't we done it? It's been tough budget times, and I've been focused on my district. I have been president of the city council, but I kind of say it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's more like group therapist than council president. There aren't a lot of formal powers given besides the negotiation of labor stuff, which I hope we get into today because I did exercise leadership there. But there hasn't been a time which I have not with the planning department, with my friend Ed Reyes, said, look, whatever resources we can get into the planning department when there's cuts, we've tried to hold the line as much as possible.
Would you stand up on Monday in council and say, we need to be doing this infrastructure report and we need to look back in time so we can establish trend lines?
Let me do better than that. I will with Tom LaBonge, who's kind of the infrastructure-focused guru in the council. He said for a long time he wants to have an infrastructure day in the city council. We're focused on nothing but that, to be able to introduce a motion to ask not only when we do an infrastructure day together, I put that motion in with him to get a report and to try to get an update. Some of it will have to be in closed session because of the lawsuit to see what we can do.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the infrastructure day was proposed by LaBonge, I think, and Councilman LaBonge, in December of 2010 or 2011, and then it was for an infrastructure day in January, which never happened.
I held one as council president, actually worked with them, we did do an infrastructure day.
But I think that I guess.
But
the
we wanted
point
to go
is,
deeper.
We're not looking for a day.
Yeah,
That's
I'm looking
cosmetics.
for an
Which
infrastructure.
is why I said we'll go a step further and
System.
actually ask for a
That's
report on that
cosmetics.
specifically.
We need a system.
You have my pledge that I will.
And I think what we find offensive is that it's the law and you guys are blatantly not obeying the law. And that we have to obey the law, find that quite offensive and arrogant.
I mean, like our community plan and the Hollywood community plan currently says that if adequate infrastructure doesn't exist in any critical area, then building controls will be put in place if you can't make a commitment to pay for the infrastructure within 12 months. It's exceptionally clear. The projects keep getting approved. So, and with a statement of consistency with the community plan. So if no one's enforcing the community plan except us and the courts, and that's in every district, your district, our district, how do we have confidence in government when we have to sue the government to make it do the right thing?
Right.
Well, I think there's at a certain level, I'm not an abstract city leader. I'm a person who lives in a neighborhood and works in a neighborhood. I talk to folks, I've had great conversations. A lot of people were for and want, with no changes to the Hollywood community plan to move forward, and others who want it, buried in a drawer. I say, I work in Hollywood. Like, I have a very selfish concern about the traffic in Hollywood because it takes me away from time with my family. It takes me away from the things that I'd like to do outside this job, which is 95% of what I do, but that last 5% I'd like to have a life and to actually do that. So when I look at something, I do it from a very selfish perspective, which is what is the impact going to be? Sometimes it's like there's the governed and the governing. We're actually all Angelinos here. And so when I look at that, it's very important. Projects that have been approved, for instance, in Hollywood, have been in the context of us reducing the population. The population's gone down, which is one of the reasons when I looked at the community plan and they had projections from SCAG that haven't come to bear. They have to revise those before I'm going to vote for this. And we're going to make sure that those numbers are correct. But projects by themselves don't always, depending on what's happening, people crammed into an old infrastructure. Projects themselves were part of that infrastructure. For instance, a project that's due to be built on Sunset Boulevard comes with a community park in a neighborhood where people have told me for 10 years, please, can I have some place to walk with my child on the way, or can I only go to a Starbucks to find common space? I'd really love to have, what's right here outside the home now. So I hear you, but just so you know, my philosophy has been also is I've looked very carefully at that. And for me, projects moving forward by themselves are not necessarily always evil. They bring with them sometimes, in the context even of a reducing population, a better quality of life. And that's the sort of projects I've tried to
Fully agree.
Okay, so, but then what's interesting to us is that, development becomes a political process because ultimately these high-profile projects go to city council for vote. So the Korean Hotel project or
Which is
AEG, try that one.
AEG, okay.
Not the Alamo, Wilshire Grant.
Wilshire Grant. I mean, they ultimately go to city council and
They get
you
fast
you
track.
guys get passed and they get fast processing and the planning department says, okay, we're supposed to move this forward. They reduce the number of public hearings. There's now this whole upzoning proposal. It's all linked together to people on city council that talk a good story. And by the way, we've had enough people here from city council and government that we know you guys all talk a good story, because otherwise you'd be accountants. Please excuse me, all the accountants in the room, okay? No, I'm just saying that this is what you do, and so, but then you pass these things.
Well,
And you have to stand on your record.
sure, exactly, and that's what I'd say. I'm not coming before you as an abstract person saying this is the starry-eyed things that I would do. I have a record, and so, part of being able to interact with you is to share some of that in detail, which never going to make a headline. I can walk you project by project. It's not to talk a good game.
Well, we see the
it's to share.
votes. I mean,
But it's more than that. But there's a lot of things that people don't see. I would love to sit you down with not a hand-picked group, but of 25 of my own constituents who are the same leaders in my district as you are here. And they probably wouldn't have as much of a, and I don't mean this in any insulting way, caricature of who we are. We actually sit down and have these negotiations. You say it becomes political. The Greek word for city and politics come from the same root, polis. Politics isn't, to me, something dirty. That's what we're doing right now. It's the engagement of people. People came to the city and then engaged with one another to find the good life. And we're here to debate and to figure out what that good life is. We don't always necessarily agree on every route to get there. But at the same time, that is why we engage in politics.
I think a lot of people in this room feel like you've taken the good life away. by all of the development and the infrastructure and,
May I take a little side shortcut here? So we talked about the fire department a bit. The one issue hasn't been discussed is that back in 2010, $30 million was taken from the fire hydrant installation and main replacement trust fund and put into the reserve fund. Can you tell me why that was done, how it was done, and don't we have a need to replace water mains?
Yes, actually a lot of water mains. DOP's in a pretty ambitious cycle right now to replace them. If you come to Silver Lake in my own neighborhood, you'll see the impact of what is happening on the street. It was done because of tough budget times to preserve other services, is what the CAO lined up for us, to make sure that people would have the day-to-day staffing of fire stations, make sure that they would have, the ability to provide city services in our libraries. I mean, that was done in a very tough time to wave off, what was projected 5 years ago as being bankruptcy next year. And it is something that should absolutely, just like the special parking revenue funds, which were also something similarly done. I mean, the question was whether we do layoffs and other things or that. In a tough budget year, that's the right thing to do, and I'll do that every single time. But it shouldn't be a permanent move.
Was it? This was a special purpose fund that was to be used only, a property-based fee, to be used only for fire hydrant installation and main replacement. So what mechanism did you use to take proprietary funds for a specific purpose and move them into the reserve fund?
I'll look into that for you. I don't know the exact reasons. I know that when they did it, like the special parking revenue funds also are a quote-unquote special fund, and it says it in the ordinance, but I think the ordinances were changed in both cases. But I'll check.
Yeah, the parking one was, but not the...
Okay, I'll look for you. I don't know. Sitting here.
it's the same thing as like the trash fees. We were told we had to have an increase in trash fees so we could have more policemen on the street. We didn't get more policemen on the street. So it's kind of like, how many examples of
I
this?
didn't say that, and I was very careful not to. I know the mayor did, but I was. I was very straightforward about what it was. So, but I appreciate that other people did.
But that's
and we did get more
aura
police
of City
officers
Hall.
on the street, but not specifically because of that. We're losing money on our trash collection, so in essence, it was a subsidy that people were paying. Some of whom weren't even getting trash collection. That made that at least a full cost recovery.
Just one last thing on the fire hydrant.
Sure.
I recall that the reserve fund was at zero, I think, at that time.
No, we've never had a reserve fund at zero.
Or maybe it was the special reserve fund.
Yeah.
One of the reserve funds was at zero.
If it happened, that happens for like a week at the end of the budget year, but we've always maintained, even in these tough budget years, we've maintained much higher than that on both the special and the...
I think I remember Councilman Zine saying, is this going to bring it from 0 to 30 or 30 to 60? And the answer was 0 to 30. Does that have an impact on the city's credit rating? Is that one of the reasons?
Absolutely. Yeah, having those reserve funds is critical to then our cost for borrowing. I've been part of us being upgraded, which I was very proud of in good times, and then downgraded to at least where we were before, which is still quite high for the country, even when you hear the headlines of being downgraded, and now going from negative watch to being stable and possibly being upgraded in the near future. And that was done. We haven't talked about it, but from labor negotiations that I led, that I personally executed, and that did more than any other big city in America to go straight on to looking at the pension crisis in a real way, $500 million of pension reform.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so let me move on to some of these other questions. Well, sort of staying with this, as a poll recently rated the Los Angeles area as the second most politically corrupt in the country, barely losing out to number 1, Chicago. Corruption has been uncovered in the Building and Safety Department. The Planning Department is rife with favoritism. As mayor, what steps will you take to root out corruption in city government?
I think I already told you my own background, the seriousness with which I take that, how I was raised. I mean, I had a father who would come home at those dinners that I mentioned, and he would tell me about public officials, police officers, for instance.
Do you have a concrete plan?
Sure. Let me get to that. So, as I was going to finish the thought, there would be police officers who would say, when he was telling you if you're corrupt, we're going after you. It would say literally, if you were dying on the street, I'd step over you, Mr. Garcetti. So I was raised in a culture of that. It's very, very deep. The article that you mentioned talked about the Los Angeles area, and there are Los Angeles City things that are troubling to me, but I think those numbers also skewed very high because of our southeast cities and other parts it was the LA area, from Riverside to Ventura, including our southeast cities. But inside the city of Los Angeles, we have to absolutely change the culture. One of the things I'd like to do with our general managers is we have a culture right now that emphasizes for our city employees the amount of fines and violations, impediments essentially they find. So at the end of the year, there is an incentive for people to be able to be lifted up by how much money they're bringing in, which doesn't always lead to people doing the right thing or not being corrupt. And when they see those money come in, I would expect from my general managers to sit down in my first month as mayor with them in my general managers meeting and say, we're going to invert that culture. We're going to judge employees by their ability of how friendly they are, by not
How what? I'm
how
sorry.
friendly they are, how much they problem solve for somebody who's doing a home renovation who has to go 13 times to City Hall, and I mean, I'm sure some of you have experienced it, or has a different inspector every single time. The last inspector says, fix this, this, and that. And the new inspector said, oh, you don't actually ever have to have done those. You had to do this, this, and that. We've all been there and experienced that. And I would put metrics, by the way, in, that I would expect by the end of the year to show that the metric, the outputs, are how quickly you assist somebody who is renovating a home, for instance, versus how long it takes today. In terms of corruption, we should have a zero tolerance. We should be referring for prosecution and make sure that there are examples made. I would like to see some, maybe even civil service reforms specifically, that make it extremely difficult once we find somebody who's clearly been corrupt. The process of getting rid of that person is so slow and so onerous, and sometimes they're even able to stay. That has to be reformed.
They go to DWP.
And that has to be done through, that may have to be done through a vote of the people. And I'd be willing to put a ballot initiative on to look at those changes. And certainly, I think the best preventive medicine is to see some people who get prosecuted and get sent to jail. That will send, trust me, the strongest signal we can in our departments. That said, this is not endemic in our departments. We can find 3 or 4 cases that have come up. I want to make sure that every single person who is not corrupt also isn't getting swept under that as well.
Patricia?
Mr. Garcetti,
Yes.
I'm from Chicago, and I
Yes.
love the corruption because things get done. The difference is here, it
So you have the
doesn't.
different right?
Right.
This is the worst of both worlds, corruption
New
that doesn't
York
get
filed for bankruptcy, and it worked. It cleaned out the cobwebs, it straightened out a lot of contracts. What would be your position for filing bankruptcy with the city of Los Angeles?
Bankruptcy is to me an admission of failure, and it's like lockouts and walkouts that we see around the country. To me, that is a failure of political leadership. In fact, it actually feeds people ideologically when, if you have a leader who kind of beats their chest at a press conference saying, we're going to go after public sector employees and they're terrible and their pensions and everything like that. If you look at the result of what they get in the negotiations, it's a pretty lousy way to start negotiating because they usually get less.
But you use the F word, failure.
Well, exactly. Well,
But that's where we are now.
we absolutely are not. I'll tell you, 5 years ago, we were projected, 4 years ago, excuse me, to be bankrupt in 5 years. The budget deficit was projected for this year to be $1 billion. Do you know what it was when we sat down to close that this year? It was $199 million. So 80% of it structurally has been addressed. And I can tell you that because I know the numbers. I was a part of those. What my style was to go to our unions and to sit down and say, look, we'll be in a room like this. You can go home and see your family at night. But otherwise, we are going to grind something out here. Because 85% of our costs is pay and benefits. 85% of it. So what we did was we sat down and we negotiated that. And I want to give you one statistic, and please just hear this before I'll jump in. Governor Christie in New Jersey was widely praised in the press for his toughness in going to public sector employees and changing their benefits. He went and increased from 5.5% of pay out of pocket, which is what they pay in New Jersey, to 7.5%. And that's going to be phased in over 7 years. And literally, I can show you the clips, all the articles that this shows you what it means when you stand up and you're tough. I negotiated going from 6 to 11% in a year. 5.5 to 7.5, 6 to 11. And when I looked at other big cities, even Atlanta, who was widely praised as the most, actually did a tiny bit less than we did. And they're the other city that has faced this square on. So I was very serious about it. Bankruptcy would be devastating to our services. It might seem attractive, but I guarantee you the first few years, watch Stockton, and you tell me if it's going to be good for the services in Stockton. It would be devastating. And Vallejo.
We see as part of the problem here is the cronyism in City Hall. That feeds into the special interests What would you do to reduce cronyism?
Define cronyism more for me, just so I can make sure I'm
Well,
addressing it.
lobbyists, the old guys network.
99.7% of all council votes being unanimous.
Right.
It's funny, on that one, if we disagree, people say, oh my God, you can't get anything done if we agree too much of the time. And 99.7% is whether something's in REAP, whether it's a Hollywood Star or Walk of Fame.
It's an exaggerated.
Yeah. And there's plenty of disagreement by the time it gets there. It's a system that's supposed to work in committee if there's disagreements, negotiations that happen. I mean, that's politics. By the time it gets to the floor, that's no different than, a lot of places. And by the way, I would much rather have unanimity than what we see in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C., which is you get completely divided votes and nobody ever doing anything. But the cronyism, I'll tell you what I've done to address it. I've written 2 different ethics reform measures that were passed by the people, Measure R, previous Measure R and Measure H, which prohibit lobbyists from donating, which now strengthen the amount that it tightened up all the rules for lobbyists, for people who aren't lobbyists but have an interest in city issues, who are special interest folks, of what they can do in terms of gifts, what they can do in terms of dinners, whether they can give money or not. Measure H I just passed because when we saw the whole airport contracts going forward, and people who were bidding on those contracts were throwing fundraisers for city council members who were up for election, I said, whether or not that was leading someone to change their vote, I said, this is horrible both in the perception and the potential reality. And now that is prohibited. When people are now, you would have thought we had that a long time ago. MTA did. We had really good, strong laws that I based on there. But so I've written laws to close the loophole in cronyism. More than anybody else who's running in this race, I'm proud of those laws. I'm glad that they're there. And if people can't raise money from real people and get elected, then that's,
Diane?
I'd like to go back to something else that you had
Sure.
said with regard to the corruption. I don't want to address the corruption, but I want to address the inability of your departments to do their jobs. We've suffered with this over the years for the Department of Building and Safety. We found all the corruption there and everything else, but even now, when you put in a request for a developer who's developing without permits, nothing happens.
You mean a request as an average citizen to like
Building and Safety to
investigate
go
or
out
something?
and investigate,
Gotcha.
and nothing ever happens. If I were developing without a permit, they'd be at my door in 10 minutes. But if you're doing a development, a commercial development, they never do anything. There's an opportunity of making money, there's an opportunity of citing them. That money isn't good enough, it's only our money, the residents who live here, that they're interested in getting, other than those from developers. You push development so hard in this city that you've absolutely destroyed this city. We can't get from point A to point B. People don't want to live here anymore. They are actually moving out of Los Angeles into other areas that are not as congested, and certainly that have government that works. This government does not work, and we've known it for a long time, because you and the city council all have your little fiefdoms there, and you're all supporting each other. So if this guy wants to build over here, you got to vote in their favor, otherwise they're not going to vote for you. That has to stop. This whole thing is just going to bring this city down, and we will go into bankruptcy, because people are not going to vote for increased taxes anymore. They're getting tired of it. They've had enough of it. You in politics, those people who sit on city council and who are running for mayor, better take note of this and be aware of it, because it is coming.
Look, I'm motivated by the same thing. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Somebody else was.
Go ahead.
I'm motivated by the same thing. There's a lot of things I could do with my life, and and I've never craved being the mayor of Los Angeles. It wasn't on my list 20 years ago. It wasn't something even a couple years ago that I had, a definite feeling I wanted to do. I'm motivated by the same thing as you. I know that I'm here, so it's good to say you've done this all. When a lot of the stuff was getting built, I was 9 years old, and 12 years old, and 18 years old. I know that. I know you meant in a general sense. The fact that west of the 405 freeway, my parents live, I can't go see my own parents, because if I can try to fit it in, it's like 10 to 2 maybe, but not now with a 405 construction. That hits me personally. It means they can't see their granddaughter. It means they can't, there's all sorts of things that affect me in a very direct way. But what I can do is I can come in and look, motivated by a love of the city and wanting to change that, and wonder why is it west of the 405? For every 4 jobs that are there, there's 1 unit of housing. Wait,
Well,
can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Clean up.
So, when you have 3 jobs that have to drive in and out of west of the 405, we've got to solve that. And we can't replicate that in other places. So when I do look at what the opportunities I have in my own district, it's not a fiefdom. And I'll stand up and walk you through any vote I take any place. I mean, I live with that.
Well, you've just appointed a planning director who has absolutely no credentials whatsoever, who doesn't even know what to do, and is only going to kiss ass, pardon the expression, everybody, of the council. They'll be directed by the council, and we as residents of the city are the ones who are going to suffer with those decisions. You've just destroyed the city with inept people. You look at your zoning administrators. You could have promoted from within people who really know the city and really understand. Instead, you bring people in that have absolutely no credentials and make them zoning administrators, and they do the worst job because all they do is cater to the developers. I mean, those things need to stop and have to be changed, and they're not going to be with a guy who's sitting in the chair of the planning director. So, I mean,
would you replace Michael LeGrand?
Oh, you know, one of the things I'd like to do and look at with all of my general managers is to tell my general managers that, you know, you're all acting general managers. And that, you know, you look at the president, you look at the governor, these executives come in and they can bring in their own cabinets. In Los Angeles, you inherit every single department head. I think it would be a huge shift in culture to say that. If you're good and you compete and you want to show me your plan, I'm not going to sweep everybody out. But you have to understand now that we're starting from scratch. This is a new administration coming in as the executive of this city. We're going to change the way business is done. This may be the last thing I run for. I haven't spent my life at City Hall. I've had 11 exhilarating years representing the heart of the city. But when I'm done, I'm done, and I want to make a difference.
Steve?
Would you appoint a new planning director?
I told you what I do with our general managers when I come in.
Say they're acting. And what does that mean?
I think it's clear.
You would do a competitive search?
With each one, it would depend on each one.
They would have to
look at some folks, and
reapply?
if they want to describe to me what they're going to do, and they're strong and they're able to continue, they've been doing a good job, they keep their jobs. But the mayor has the power to appoint and to fire department heads.
And would
The council can overrule it with a 2/3 vote.
Would you build a committee?
I would always reach out to our leadership, including you all, to get the sort of feedback that I'm hearing today. That's who I am.
But would you set the parameters under which the director should work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to come in,
I mean,
just so
you
you know how I'm
tell
running this campaign.
This is the job I want you to do.
I'm running this campaign not just as give me a chance and then I'll tell you what I'm going to do. In parallel to this, I've been convening groups to essentially be a transition team at the same time. I welcome anybody who's not so burnt out and so angry that wants to be a part of that to join with me as we're having these private conversations. Doesn't mean you endorse me. I just want the best minds and people who have the best experience to be talking about that at the same time. So when I come in, yes, my agenda is going to be clear on American parks. My agenda is going to be clear on fire. I mean, I'll be saying a lot of it during the campaign, but the detail of it will be really fleshed out. So we don't sound like the candidate and I win and I go, now what?
Okay. All right, Steve?
Briefly, if I understood you correctly about decisions, deciding things in committee, and we come to the vote in council, what's the point then of, for instance, spending 5 hours at council committee and with all the public speakers if the vote has already been decided, or in another case where somebody says at 6 o'clock in the evening, somebody says, "Oh, I gotta go. I've got another committee." You lose your quorum. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of people spent the day there and accomplish nothing. Numbers of people have told me so it's a complete waste of time to say anything. Although you're all very polite, and it sounds silly, but I appreciate that you treat everybody well. But I've been thinking about that for some time, and because nothing is decided there, it's already previously decided. Because once it comes to the vote, it's already done. So other than feeling good, yourself feeling good for standing up and saying, "I stood up in front of these people," what's going on?
I can tell you how it affects me. I mean, it always affects me. And now I'm a council member, not council president. I think those of you who ever came to me as council president, it's tough. I mean, talk about multitasking. Usually I have one council member talking in this area, you have a clerk telling you something, you have someone speaking at the same time, and maybe staff members saying, "Don't forget to take up this item next." But I always, whenever I could, and I think as much as anybody, if not more, made eye contact and listened. It could be a gadfly on their 60th time there who has never said anything that I've agreed with, but maybe the 61st time they're going to. Or it could be a person showing up for the first time at her wit's end, about to be kicked out of her apartment, who's asked every city department to help, and she might be homeless next week, and we've gone out there and actually saved her from that. to Mike's point about whether we always agree, I mean, just in recent weeks, I've cast losing votes that have been different than other folks, so I do that all the time. I didn't think it was right to cut off our remote testimony from Van Nuys and San Pedro. I was very proud of having done that as council president. A Valley council member himself decided to cut off because they don't like that it's just 2 or 3 gadflies that show up, it seems like, and it seems very expensive. They want to get rid of $50,000. But what if it's somebody who doesn't want to be stuck in traffic to come downtown, and we set up something that allows them in San Pedro or Van Nuys to testify live? I was in vote against that when the CRA was getting abolished, and whether or not we should be the successor agency or not. I lost that vote and voted for those city employees that I thought actually it would be better to have control than to put it in the hands of some state-appointed bureaucracy, which is what the case is now. So I don't know. I can just answer for myself. I can't answer for 14 other people, although I've tried to share and promote that culture as much as I can, that I do listen, that it isn't pre-cooked for me. But the importance of it is getting, the only thing in terms of, yeah, it is tough to show up after 12 months of something and say, oh, by the way, stop, because people do thinking. And that's important, and I think this group is particularly good at getting involved early. So, if it is somebody showing up at the very end, maybe people haven't completely made up their minds, but they've thought about it and they actually have an opinion. It may not be the way that the folks who show up want, and oftentimes when I am basically agreeing because I have gone through the thinking through of something, and that's just where my opinion is at. It is tough to unwind someone's opinion when they've done the work and been thoughtful, but I always listen to make sure, just in case somebody may make that case and I may be swallowed.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to get back to Marcia's actual original question, which is corruption and ethics. So on the books right now, section 470K,
Exactly.
it talks about assumed name contributions. And if a candidate realizes or is told that they have received assumed name contributions, they must disgorge that to the Treasury within 10 days. Ethics has decided unilaterally to ignore the charter, and they do not
like people
enforce
who
it.
shell contributions, like somebody's name that's
It's like if I give you $1,000 to get my
right,
project.
gotcha, sorry.
That would be longer, right?
Yeah,
It's laundered money.
it is, yeah.
It's laundered money. So ethics has unilaterally decided not to enforce section 470K and is not seeking to get the dirty money back from the politicians. So
I'll ask Marlene Cantor, who's who I appointed, but now she's independent when she gets appointed. Can't remove her, which is a good thing. She's great, and I will ask her about that. I didn't do that.
because, again, we're in a position where a law is on the books. It's exceptionally clear. And I sat down with Leanne Pelham and I said, it says right here you're supposed to do
Have you
it.
talked to the new ethics
No.
director? I'd be happy to arrange. She's great, and I'd be happy to arrange a meeting.
That'd be super. But what Leanne Pelham told me was, we don't go after people whose committees are closed.
Yes.
And oh, by the way,
Yeah.
we wouldn't get to it until after their committee's closed. So we would never basically,
Actually have any money to.
well, they would never ever get to it. And so there are many elected officials right now, and past elected officials, who still have not disgorged
Disgorged that
this money.
Obviously I know that because I've read about it in the news too, that folks who have been caught for doing that and for actually doing the laundering of that
Never
money,
get punished.
well, they've had to pay.
They don't punish. They don't
But here's the problem.
Yeah.
If let's say I want to get some money to your campaign, and I say, hey Lucy, here's $1,000,
Right.
give it to her. Well, and I get caught. All that happens is I have to pay maybe triple the penalty. So the politician actually is more indebted to the person because now that they've had to pay more, the politician still gets use of the money. So you still get the influence, you still get elected.
Okay.
So,
Until you take the dirty.
like when that happened to Weiss, when that happened to Hahn, none of them ever gave it.
No,
back.
never gave the money back.
All right, well, I'll set up something with Marlene and
The mayor
and I
gave
executive
back
director.
a little bit.
And the fact is, it's bigger than that. It's the global issue
Well,
of unethical
I
behavior.
would love, and I've been an outspoken proponent of and served on the state board of California Clean Money Campaigns to have a public funding of our campaigns.
But
You want that?
nobody will ever vote for it.
Well, let me give you the
That's
solution.
pretty conservative states and pretty liberal states have.
Okay, One
I
solution.
hold out hope, but
One solution is the city should be the treasurer for all campaigns. That's one quick, easy solution. Because there's a lot of funny business goes on with treasurers. But having said that,
yes.
Don't we
um,
know that?
but having said that, Kindy Durkee,
Right.
would you? Do you support ethics enforcing all of the city's ethics laws?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's simple. Okay.
So So as a member of city council, what will you do about it?
Well, I've strengthened ethics laws. I've gone through that before. I'll set up when I hear about new things like this. I'll set up directly. You know, we fix problems. When we learn about them, that's my job. Yeah.
Okay, so as mayor, we will, if you are elected mayor, we would expect you then to move forward with ethics reform,
Sure.
ethics enforcement, ethics culture.
Because I have as a councilman.
Okay.
Stronger than anybody in the
Oh, but
state.
you know, let me also say, we've heard a lot of promises over
Yeah.
the years. We interview these candidates and they make promises.
I agree. That's why I
And-
mentioned Measure R,
We're so-
Measure H. I passed it. These are laws now, and they're being enforced.
H is a good one.
Yeah, well,
That's not a promise. It's a delivery.
Okay, what's the question, Diana?
no, I'm just saying.
I hear you. I have that same frustration, which is why I want to take action and put it to the voters.
Okay, but for Measure H, just so you know,
Yeah.
which is really a good law,
Thank you.
there's no method right now. If you have no way of knowing if you've taken money from these people, there's no database of contractors.
What I do, and what I'd like to see maybe, what I do in my campaign is I actually have a checklist on anybody who's donating, so they read it and have to like assert that they're not. So at least I have a record that they're.
Well, but then you're putting the ethics laws in the hands of the person who wants to gain.
But it's a double check, because I agree with you, but there's no absolute way to completely, unless it's,
Okay, so we
We do have one
need to move on, but.
that was a part of Measure H, so actually developing a database.
So we need to move on. So as we're talking about special interests, do you know what percentage of your contributions have come from special interests?
How do you define special interest?
Well-
Somebody wants a stop sign on their street?
No, let's say specific industries.
No, but I'll tell you this, I know that over 60% of my donors had never given to city elections before, and they came from all 15 city council districts in the city.
Well, we know that 40% of your contributions have come from one or more special interests. So for example, 14% came from entertainment, 6% came from financial and investors.
But let's be clear, if somebody is a television writer or a grip, like you can collapse those into those categories. But I guarantee you, I have a younger set of people who have not participated in politics before, who don't have anything that they need from city government. I'm very proud. I'll invite you to come to my fundraisers, and of course you can contribute if you'd like to as well. But you'll see Los Angeles at my fundraisers. You'll see normal folks who care about their communities, and I'm doing a series of non-fundraising meetings in all 93 neighborhoods of this city. Living room conversations where I'm seeking supporters, and I don't ask them for that.
But we know that more than 1 in 10 of your contributors from construction, real estate, so developers, I mean, we know they're contributing to your campaign, and let's face it, we're not stupid here. We know that people contribute because
Doesn't matter to
they believe that
And
there's
if
something in it. The
I bet 1 out of
attorneys.
10 employees in the city of Los Angeles, so people who work in any industry, come from construction. I think if you're telling me that 50% of my money came from developers, and I've seen campaigns that are there, I'd be worried. I would not be. This is a reflection, I believe, of the city.
We took it off the ethics site, so, and it's easy to do.
Okay.
So what we're doing is we're looking at that, and
Okay.
then we look at your record for passing these developments, these AEG things, the Grand Hotel, all of these. We wonder what's the linkage.
To me, I look at every issue on its own merits. I don't, my campaign staff and my city staff don't know one from the other, so somebody who's actually working on an issue doesn't know that. As much as possible, whenever there's been somebody who's had something before me, even though there's no ethics laws not to, I try not to take that money. Sometimes I won't know because it'll be a wife of or something of, but once it's in there, like, who cares? It's not gonna influence me. I mean, when you look at those statistics, I'm actually quite proud of what you just said.
Okay. So do you support the new stadium?
If they can prove their environmental challenges right now.
How do they do that? I'd like to
Well,
know
yeah,
that.
I mean, a few different things. I mean, one is going to be the impact of actually making transit work downtown. If they're not going to be a part of solving a downtown connector that'll take our north-south lines and our east-west lines and bring them together, that was the great promise of our transit that hasn't still been done, so that you have to step from one line to another and sometimes walk blocks to get to them. It will never work and never, you won't have critical mass on these lines until we do that. So I think that's going to be really important for them to be able to prove. The traffic flow, it was worrying to me what I saw initially for the 4-level, because I live very close to that. I live in Silver Lake, and I come through that, and that is one of the most congested. The 101 backs up almost to the Cahuenga Pass because of how bad that stretch between Silver Lake and downtown is. So I think that they should be playing a role to do that. Initially, they said, we've already done all of our improvements, because all those 110 improvements that are happening that were from the Staples and LA Live stuff, they're like, we've already done that out. And my opinion is, I don't think they have yet. And making sure that the impact isn't just about the football stadium. Because remember, this is really, as a football stadium deal, this isn't very interesting to me. I wouldn't have spent much time on it besides liking football and thinking we deserve a team. There's not a lot of permanent jobs after the construction jobs are there. For the convention center, there is, but that's where the real impact's going to be, not from the football game on Sundays. But if we have more work there, if it doesn't come along with, one of the other environmental things real quick, if it doesn't come along with hotels that are actually going to be there on site so that conventioneers will walk there, and if they're still coming from hotels in Beverly Hills and from Hollywood and other places, we can't see an uptick in that sort of use of the convention center without the infrastructure within a walking distance.
Do you look at traffic or environment or both?
Well, both. I used traffic as a kind of the environmental impact report sense of environment.
Well, because there's air,
Yeah.
there's greenhouse, there's
Right.
traffic.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole.
One of the developers' plans for solving the traffic problem, and they used that word solving, was to give ticket holders a pass to ride on the public transportation. From our perspective, out here in the
Sure.
real world, that speaks volumes about the influence that AEG, Tim Lewicki, and their cronies have in the city. And yet nobody, or at least it appears everybody's looking at this, and we've interviewed other candidates. Great idea, we need a football stadium.
No, I've been very clear about what their threshold is, and Bill Rosendahl and I have done a number of things. He's just done the latest letter on it. I think he's been very good at making sure. Look, and folks like NRDC, who initially like this could be a good idea, but they're telling the truth when if they're saying it's deficient in this area. I take that extremely seriously. More seriously than what AEG says is what DC says to me. So I agree. It's not going to solve. It has to be much more than giving out a pass on a metro system that's not built out.
Did you support what went on? Not that you have anything to do with it. What went on in Sacramento to get this fast tracked?
The fast tracking in terms of the CEQA appeals. There is something about having predictability both for those who sue and who are sued of it being efficient, but not the loss of any step of the environmental impact report or CEQA requirements. So I'm fine with reforming the judicial system to allow that, but we have to have the resources in the judicial system. I'm sure you'd like, when you have a lawsuit, some outcome, as long as it isn't fast tracking any of the testimony. But it takes so long right now. I mean, we had a good project, for instance, in Hollywood that had community support, homeowners associations, neighborhood council. One person sued, went all the way up to the California Supreme Court. We won every level and won there ultimately, but the project got killed because of the financing fell apart. And it's just because it took so long. So I think we all have a stake in making sure our judicial system.
But when you cut out
But it shouldn't just be one group.
ability to sue.
And nobody should have the groups. That should never.
Well, that's what happened.
Okay, but when you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nikki, go ahead.
Speaking of which,
Sure.
can you speak to the lawsuit that the Arab prince who wants to build on Tower Lane is suing the city because the city has required him to go through a CEQA, full environmental?
I support that we have to go through that CEQA process, and we'll be litigating it pretty aggressively. So I can't talk about too much more about it because we're in litigation, but yeah.
And there was a good case that came down just recently that would support the city's position.
Yes, I think we're in good footing.
Okay, can I ask a question? Diana?
I see a very interesting question. As mayor, what policies, Mayor Barbosa, will you continue and what will you change? I think that's an interesting question.
Well, sorry, what policies would I change in Mayor Barbosa, and which would I keep?
Or which ones would you continue?
Well, first and foremost, it's kind of the style approach. I mean, I'm not a big believer, like I told you with the pension reform, in holding a press conference saying what I'm going to do. I don't like groundbreakings. I like ribbon cuttings. I like to actually achieve things and then come to folks and talk to them about. So I think you'd see a stylistic change. I think we've had to settle for mayors who are kind of sometimes know the nuts and bolts of City Hall, but couldn't inspire the city to a wider vision, and then others who speak a good vision, but don't necessarily have the implementation of focus. To me, I'd be very locally focused. I mean, the main thing that I want to do as mayor is, be here in Los Angeles. I'm not interested in kind of my next step. I'm actually interested in 8 years where we turn around the city and look back and say, okay, we finally figured it out. It was a painful time that we went through, but we're entering kind of a second golden age here, similar to the city I grew up in.
Yeah, let me just add this, but in some cases, in order to get federal funding, you need to go.
Oh no, I would not travel, don't get me wrong, but I'd be focused here. I mean, I will go to Asia to set up trade, investment, and tourism offices, not necessarily to go on a trade junket.
He's talking about showboating versus concrete, achievements.
I mean, and I'd make sure that those trips were very much linked to very specific. And to the mayor's credit, when he does go to DC, quite often he has actually been very aggressively lobbying for stuff. But sometimes we say what we're going to have achieved before we even set about starting the work of it. You know, how many trees we're going to plant, how many, whatever it is, without going into great details. I think that by and large, I would change the culture. I've addressed that a little bit. My general managers meetings right now, my understanding of them is a kind of, okay, here's what the mayor's doing and we need you all to talk about it. I would have a general managers meeting where if Mike was heading up one department, I'd say, okay, this is a problem that he faces. 5 of you from other departments, can you get together with him and try to problem solve it? By the way, that empty seat that's here, that general manager isn't here anymore, and I'm going to tell you why, that he or she didn't meet my expectations. And by the way, here's another general manager who didn't quite solve the problem, but failed forward in experimenting and being innovative. And I want you to be doing that, and let's figure out how we can do that better and how they're going to get there. So to me, part of the management issue of being mayor is really focusing in on your managers and creating a culture of innovation, creating a culture of openness and accessibility, not one of propaganda distribution. So that'd be the biggest thing.
Okay, Shannon.
So what you're saying is, for example, if Zev said, I can't get to the opera downtown in 20 minutes, and so therefore we really need to have the Pico Olympic one-way back up. You're not going to have a press conference at the corner of Overland and Pico with everybody showing up saying,
Hypothetically, no.
we're doing this, we're
No.
putting it in.
And that's a really good point. I think the politics, we're very good in the city of not doing things. As much as I know you paint a picture of what's happened in the city, we're very good at articulating what we're against. We're very good at stopping things. And it's often because we have to play defense because nobody's including us at the beginning of the planning process. So lawsuits that you have to throw down, I know come from that frustration of years of not being at the table, of not thinking ahead of time. If we want to solve traffic and have reversible lanes or even one-way streets, that starts with the people who are there, not an abstract planning idea from City Hall or a couple other people, and then you do a press conference, and then you begin the political work. You've lost before you've begun. You know, Jackie Goldberg, my predecessor, taught me the best lesson, I think, about politics. She said, you can't dismiss fear. Fear is real. It comes from some place that people genuinely, they have a genuine reason to fear something. You have to understand it, you have to feel it, before you can begin to transform it. And for me, that means starting with being humble enough to listen first. I mean, coming here, I sense a lot of anger here. I sense a lot of frustration here. I sense a lot of you guys and you, and I'm here, and look, I'm a big boy. I know that's why I run for office, and I'll be that lightning rod. But my style has always been, if you talk to the same parallel leaders as you in my own district, it's to sit down first and just try to figure out, how do we hear that so that we don't get a stupid idea before, we listen to people who will be most affected by it.
Okay. Can you tell us how you would organize the mayor's office, what deputy mayors you would have?
I don't know yet, and it's too early, but I'll let you know I've been thinking a lot about it, but I don't want this is too early in the process for me to say what it would be. One thing that I would do is I'd move a lot of the people who come into the office. The office has grown exponentially.
Yes.
I'd move people out. I'd move them into the streets.
208 people.
Yeah.
Antonio's got 208.
That's really
Carrying a mayoral card, yeah.
And of course, he took people from other departments,
Yep, so
kept
there's
them
also
on
the
the
detailed ones
salaries.
that are there, yeah.
kept
I
them on
want
the
to
salaries of
move
those
more people out
departments.
there to the streets, like I do in my own district, who actually go proactively talk to people, look at the streets and what's happening. I would order things quite differently, and I also would look at people to have subject area expertise. So when I talk about a chief technology officer or a chief information officer, that to me is a better structure than a deputy mayor for X, Y, and Z. You're now in charge of a technology strategy for the city. You're in charge of getting information to our constituents. You're in charge of our environmental policies for the whole city. There's been a lot of people who've had chief sustainability officers or chief executive environmental officers. Though CEO gets confusing for folks. So I'm looking more towards that model than, everybody's a deputy mayor and building up the political staff. I don't need a press office of whatever it is, 12 people or something.
Okay. So what's your view on the cell tower ordinance?
We just had that in Public Works. Actually, a lot of folks from the community here came and testified as well. I think that the cell towers that we have right now are they're pretty much abominations the way they look. This is a good example of the city not getting out in front of things. Street lights. Have you guys ever heard of Vermonica? It's okay. So in Santa Monica, Vermont, there's a shopping center there. It's across from our street lighting yard. It's in my district. And there's an example of every street lighting light there in the city. So it's a great place to go shop for a neighborhood. It's like, I want to have street lights, and here's the old, pendant and the teardrop and the different ones, like really beautiful street lights. And it's a good way of showing that you can have nice urban design. Cell towers, like a fake palm tree that doesn't look, not fooling anybody, looks like a palm tree. Why wouldn't we, as a city, had design standards and had a design competition here in the city of Los Angeles, where we have SciArc and Otis and all these people who are producing beautiful things for other cities and other places. It could even be a signature architectural element for us to be able to say, this is our expectation of whether it's put on an existing light or whether or not we do them as standalone, something that people go, that's a beautiful contribution, as opposed to taking what we have now. 2 blocks from my parents' house, there's a power pole that has 15 tubes on both sides and this kind of strange beast of a cell tower.
Why isn't that happening? Why
I'm trying to, I just joined the Public Works Committee, and I've actually started reaching out to some of our design colleges, and with, a bunch of folks from homeowners groups here, we're really excited about it, and I would look forward to collaborating with them. I don't know. In city council, you can specialize in a couple areas. I chaired our Housing Community Economic Development Committee. I wasn't on Public Works, but when I've seen this problem, it's frustrated me over years. I'd like to help solve that.
Okay, Nikki?
Along with that, there's been a concern for many years about health hazards of the cell towers, yet that's forbidden to be brought into objections to the cell towers.
Yeah, and that happens with federal legislation. We're pretty defenseless, but people should lobby and let Congress members know that that's really important. They took completely, just like cable, we can't regulate anymore because of a backroom deal that happened up in Sacramento, where we actually were able to do things. We have zero power over cable now.
Okay. Patricia?
Are you aware of the findings on Burbank turning down additional cell towers?
No, tell me about it.
You don't have to tell you about it, get your staff to go and pull it up, just happened about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
They
So
said
they have a
no.
moratorium, essentially?
Said no, yeah, correct.
Okay.
And Emily Gable was sitting on their board.
Yeah, she's great.
Okay. As mayor, how would you reduce the influence of the IBEW?
Well, we have a problem with the Department of Water and Power where, I don't know what the exact percent is, 92% or something of the employees are represented by a single union. So, we've tried to, over the years, for instance, say to management, you have to put together a strike plan. So at least if people are saying, look, if you don't give us everything, we're going to strike, we'd have some people who could keep the water and power system on. And I think that's first and foremost very critical. Secondly, I think it's very important for us to try to get, it's been 40 years in the making, so it's not easy to undo, but especially with like positions where it's a parking lot attendant, for the city, and a parking lot attendant for a DWP, to get some parallel wage and benefits. IBEW, I got actually to step up a couple of years ago and do one of the first give backs they've done in a long time, and they took their what would have been their raises as cash instead of, they already had been negotiated, so they legally could have them, but they took them as cash instead of as something on the base, and they did the same thing with their pension. So in other words, it didn't compound the base, but they kind of stayed flat. And that was one of the first times we're going to see a little bit of a narrowing of the wages. But like I said, it's 30 or 40 years in the making. Labor law is what labor law is, so they've organized very effectively, but there is a monopoly there right now. I think a lot of people are looking at different things, whether it be ballot initiatives to be able to look at some of that, but it's very difficult for the city to pass something in conflict with federal law once this has been organized. So I would, lastly, the main way I looked at the department, period, was I was kind of fed up with this being the largest utility in the country with no independent oversight. So I authored Measure U, which was the creation of a ratepayer advocate, a guy who was hired from, Mr. Pickle, hired from, he's been a neighborhood council activist, he's also been somebody who has a great background in power and in water stuff. He's on board now. And finally, we'll have not only a second look at proposed rate increases when we saw them lie to us 2 years ago and we beat that back, and I led the charge for that, but also just on the operations, which I think gets to the heart of that question too. What can we be doing more efficiently? What do other places do, and how do we compare to the utilities around us?
Okay.
And thank you for everybody who voted for it. Appreciate it.
Mike?
Let me ask you probably the most important question about the budget.
Right.
Okay, so we have about 20 billion in bond debt right now. About conservatively 20 billion in critical infrastructure, conservatively, that needs to be replaced. Maybe 8, 9, 10 billion in unfunded pension mandates.
It's down considerably, but there's still some, but it's down considerably.
It's in the good B's.
Yeah, it's a big.
You have 750 million coming up with the telecommunications lawsuit. You have 500 million in comp time that we're paying police with and other people. And because of the inflated assumed rate of return, you're underfunding pensions on an ongoing basis by 100 to 200 million a year. If you put that all together, to pay for it with a bond would exceed the discretionary budget of the city by probably 200%. So how is it possible to get out? Even if you cut government by 20%, which would be amazing, you still don't even get close. So how does the city avoid bankruptcy?
Well, we are going to, and we are right now as we speak. I'll tell you 3 steps we've taken and about 3 or 4 that we need to. We've downsized our non-sworn, meaning non-fire, non-police, civilian workforce by 4,900 people in the last few years. That's to the same level as when Tom Bradley left office with 1 million more people here. Gets to the heart of all the rest of the things we want to do in planning, street services, and everything else. But we've done it because businesses have to do this, households have to do it, we have to do it. As council president, I had colleagues who said, let's take an axe to this entire government, cut it apart so much you would have almost no services. And I had others who said, let's just add a 0 and look, it's balanced, which is what essentially Sacramento is doing, projecting time after time. We had sober projections. We reduced, I don't know any other level of government that's downsized so aggressively, so quickly, 4,900 positions. Through some layoffs, but mostly through early retirements. And then the folks who did the early retirements, everybody who stuck around taxed themselves to pay for the delta there. It's like, if this half of the table said, I want to leave 2 years early, give me 2 years of work credit, and all of us who are staying there working said, okay, we'll pay extra for you to have those 2 years. It was a pretty extraordinary thing that the employees stepped up, but they did that to avoid most layoffs. Pension reform that I mentioned already, so I won't go over that, $500 million of pension reform, not just on the non-sworn side, but the sworn side too, which unfortunately has to go to voters, but we wrote something, negotiated, went to the ballot, passed them for all new hires. Doesn't, unfortunately. Then the third area, which nobody was talking about, was the cost of healthcare. Healthcare was as big, if not bigger, than pensions. And nobody was mentioning it. This whole pension craze around the country. And myself and Bill Rosendahl were the ones who raised this. And so a couple things happened. For the first time, people are paying for their retired healthcare, which was just granted. Why should, and secondly, we were not paying anything out of pocket for our healthcare. So why should we care that healthcare costs tripled? We didn't feel it. So it's not a big amount, but for the first time I negotiated paying out of pocket, so we have some skin in the game. So we'll make healthier decisions. So we'll bring down the risk pool. All of those things that good management should have been doing a long time ago. And we inherited a lot of these contracts. So those are 3 things we've done. Moving forward, we need to look at our retirement age. That's going to be critically important. When Social Security was brought into this country, 63 was the average life expectancy. So it was like if you were going to live longer, that's when it was coming in there. When you're looking at retirement age, it's going to be incredibly important for us to do that reform. Secondly, on comp time for the police department, we have to manage that, and we are actually doing a decent job, but we need a mayor who's going to really push this, that's managed in time off, not in money given. So for those of you who don't know that, basically, the police took their hit by overtime they would have got. They get what's called comp time, which can be give cash out check at the end of your time, or you get enforced vacation. And so far, we've been doing a good job of making that enforced vacation, so it's not going to come out of the city treasury. But then last, we have to bring down the assumption, I think, too, further, not just to 7.75, but I think that's still too aggressive.
7.95 right now, isn't it? Because
one of them 7.75, one 7.9. Yeah. Depends if police fire versus places.
We need to just move on.
Sure.
We need to
Just
just,
just a quickie. There's, it's like a running joke amongst us with tiers.
Right.
That when there's an announcement that we're doing layoffs and we're moving people around, you can see the parade going from City Hall to DWP. They're going there because their salaries are increased measurably by walking over there.
Yeah.
So how do they retaliate? They're without pensions, without anything. They put in these assessments on your water and power bill. Is it to cover those 1,500 people that walked across the street? I think that there needs to be some serious investigation. In the last 2 years, how many people walked across the street?
Well, to be clear, those who walk across the street have to go to a vacancy that the department already has.
Trust me, have you been in that building lately?
Yeah, of
The
course.
improvements in there?
Yeah. No, I hear you, and you're right about the disparity of the pay, and they're talking about that. But I want to also be clear that we have not, there has been no, and you can't, without some approval from the Water and Power Commissioners and the City Council, we have not taken, whatever it is, 10,000 employees at DWP and said, oh, let's make it 12,000 so that these 2,000 people can go over there. We haven't done that. It's been when people retired, they filled a vacant position. But you're right about the disparity on it.
but then you haven't reduced city government.
That's right.
You've transferred that asset
But we've addressed
to a
bankruptcy of
different-
the general fund of the city, trust me.
Well,
that is.
But you've found a way to pass it on through rates.
No.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Let's be very clear on this.
Both are true.
No, yeah, they're both, well, not exactly. I want to agree with you that the disparity between the pay and the costs and pensions and other things between DWP and the city exists and needs to be addressed.
Okay.
But we have not taken, in the midst of a deficit, some of that deficit and put it through into the DWP by expanding the size of the DWP and then taxing. We have not done that.
Okay, so, so as city council member, you have done very little to execute any of the city audits done by the controller's office. How do you explain that?
I don't chair our audits committee, but I'll tell you, actually, I reject the assumption. One, I've actually launched things that have led to the audits, and I've created very important committees that have identified and now passed in our budgets the cost savings and revenue enhancements that I would say outpace anything that was put into those audits. I'll give you an example, CORE, the Commission on Revenue Efficiency, was something I created. I appointed the chair. I pushed and pushed and pushed to make sure that it was put into this year's budget because people were just sitting on it.
But Ron Galpin tells us that there's so many of his recommendations have not been executed.
And you ask him who's the person who's been championing that alongside me. I mean,
His report is awesome.
it is, and it happened because I created that, and I have as much ownership of it as him. I'm a huge fan. After he ran in CD5 and was talking about this stuff, I said after he lost, about 2 weeks later, I said I want to have lunch with you, and I sat down and we envisioned what this whole thing was. And what we've implemented this year, for instance, on the parking tax revenues, which is the biggest bang for the buck, finally got into this year's budget. I fought for that incredibly aggressively. There's nobody running for office who's done as much, and I was the person who gave birth to it.
Okay, so then how come you're supporting Dennis Stein for controller?
Because I think he'll make a good controller. He's been a friend of mine. He's somebody who I think will be tough with that stuff. If you listen to him on these issues, I think there's not going to be a harder-nosed person. I think the world of Ron. I endorsed Dennis before Ron got in, but I stand by my endorsement.
Okay.
Plus, Dennis is a crack house.
He's a good entertainer.
He's a great entertainer.
I take it more serious than that.
So going to those issues, as mayor, what will you do to increase the collection of debts owed to the city, especially,
Well,
let's say, by
mayor,
parking lots?
I would have hired a collection sheriff about a year quicker than this mayor did.
Okay.
And I had good people for that person to be hired, et cetera, and I would have somebody with a background specialty. We finally have a person there, and so that's in place. Somebody who's come from the port.
May I recommend you make a phone call to New York? They have the most efficient collection
No, I know.
in the entire United States.
We studied that one, yeah, no, absolutely. I'm actually well familiar, and I've met with Mayor Bloomberg on this and on some of his technology improvements, absolutely.
Okay. So, as member of City Council, you voted for a number of important issues that allowed problems to fester and to get worse over time. By the way, these are questions that came from the group.
Sure.
Okay, I didn't make these up.
Don't worry, I'm not taking it here.
You know, for example.
Just raise your hand if it's your question.
You know, you as a member of City Council allowed the marijuana dispensaries to proliferate. The billboard blight proliferate. Why should we trust you? And you were party to the agreement that Jack Weiss and Rocky Delgadillo came up with regarding billboards. So you and then you were part of the group that voted for billboard signs downtown, and when the sign ordinance was So why should we believe you? That's the bottom line.
Well, because I've been clear. I'm not an absolutist on these things. I think there's some places in my own district, for instance, if I could switch out I think it was 15.
Can you stick with this?
I'm trying to. Sometimes I can't get through half a sentence. I swear I'm not avoiding, but please give me the respect
This is like the
to
Supreme
hear
Court.
through. I know.
would say
Right.
anything.
It is. It's a good group of justices, but I do want to be able to. I'm not taking it someplace else. I'm hitting it straight on.
Okay.
There are 15 small billboards in yards on the way home to my home in Echo Park. And we set up a system where those can get switched out to someplace along Hollywood Boulevard or something where there's been 60 years of some signs. And to me, for every single person in Echo Park, as well as the folks that were right there in Hollywood, they said, that's a good thing to do. I also authored, if you're saying why believe me, because I also authored whenever we've learned from these. I'm never going to be the sort of elected official who doesn't learn from mistakes, who authored the ban on super graphics in my own district with a lot of pressure right now to get rid of it every single day, because I saw what happened. I saw a ton of illegal billboards go up, and I saw entire buildings getting wrapped. And I said enough is enough. There were times when we couldn't get an investment in Hollywood, and it could be the difference between the investment. But once that happened, all it did was inflate land use prices, and everybody said, I have to have a billboard for this to work. And I said that, so I learned from that piece, while it was good that it got a project or two done, at that point I was like, no more. When I didn't read about the fine print at the end of the settlement about the digital switch outs, that was a mistake. I mean, the volume of what we're given and that we have to rely on people, it's not an excuse. I'll tell you what happened is I didn't read it. If I had read it, I wouldn't have known, but people said, don't worry, this is what was presented to us by the city attorney. And nobody ever mentioned it.
pocket of the billboard industry.
Yeah. Right. So lesson learned to like make sure, even if I can't, they're reading every last.
Which is
you know,
why you should
idea.
always go through the campaign contributions.
Exactly, yeah, exactly right. I agree. And when you compare, I'll win on that front besides a self-funder who, you know, that's a whole other thing, but somebody can come in and drop their own money.
Where's the finding on all this? Gotta go back 20 years with billboard issue when the Korean community came to the Federation and was looking for money to make the city accountable for the illegal billboards, and it's been over 20 some odd years. So where's the
In Hollywood, there's fines and there's been people, as you know,
Where's the
from my
recourse?
district thrown in jail. And it was one of the most effective things the city attorney did in terms of them being able to get out in front. And a lot of boards came down when that
That
was
came
presented.
from this, that
Yeah.
came from us.
Well, thank you for
We
that.
were pushing with the billboard,
Well, thank you
the
for helping out in my
Billboard
district because it was that beautiful building
Association.
that's right across the Hollywood.
That
Highway.
and the medical marijuana.
Yeah, the Bank of Hollywood building
Yeah,
was.
we were
It
really.
was the one where a guy could put up a billboard once during the Academy Awards, earn all the money for the year, and we wonder why that's been vacant for that many years. I mean, I had Michael Eisner, when he was getting his star on the Walk of Fame, say Disney would love to buy that building and have it be a dynamic store and office structure. The guy won't sell to anybody because he was able to put up an illegal billboard for years. And we found that a city attorney, and it wasn't just this city attorney that I asked to enforce, but we finally had one who enforced it. So there have been not only punishment, fines. I have gotten sideways with a number of our business owners in Hollywood who are not friends with me anymore because I haven't yielded on this, and some of them have faced pretty hefty fines on what they
these
put
are the
up.
friends you want
Yeah,
around the
of
city?
course. No, I agree.
Marcia, I want to get
That's why I'm here.
ask me on trust, because I think trust is important. And you actually said something that you hadn't read it.
Yeah.
And if you can't, I mean, you guys are supposed to be our representatives.
Yep.
And if you don't read it, then aren't you subjecting yourself to the special interests who can get to the staff members?
Absolutely.
And let me give you one specific
Sure.
example. There was that restaurant, what was that restaurant that got a big $2.6 million,
Oh, yeah,
I forgot the name of it.
I'll think of it in a
Okay,
second.
but this was a.
Herb Wesson's
Yeah,
district.
Weston's district. Okay. There was
Oh, Harold and Maude?
Harold
That's
and
it.
Maude's.
So I actually took the time to read all 5 pages of it for fun.
Good for you.
And all 5 pages, it's not hard.
Yeah.
That business was going to do $60,000 a year if everything went well. And the city said, we're going to give them $2.6 million.
That was a loan or a grant?
It was a loan guarantee.
A loan. Loan.
And then 2.4 of it went directly to the previous owners. Didn't even go into creating a new business. On a business that was valued in the paper at 1.3, which was excessive considering it was only going to net 60 a year.
Yeah.
And so I asked one of your competitors in the mayor race, how do you justify that? Oh, well, I had staff look at it. But you guys voted for it. So if you're not reading it, and this stuff is getting pushed through, that's the kind of corruption I think everybody's talking about.
Right.
It's not even, might not even hit you.
Yeah,
But you guys are casting the vote yes, and we're going like,
Yeah.
what's going on?
All I can say is now,
It's a culture of
when
corruption.
I learned a couple times, I read things extremely carefully. I'm never going to be 100% perfect, but I'm going to try to get as close to perfect as I can get. And also I'm going to look at economic development, to your point specifically. I do look at grants and loans quite differently. And I'm going to look at also, I mean, for instance, when Coda Automotive is an electric car manufacturer, if you're in the Westfield Mall, they're trying to sell their battery technology company. I've on and off driven electric cars for 11 years, know a lot about it, pursued this company for a long time to a city that's not known as business friendly. And we've got them to the city. We identified an old Sony warehouse on Fairfax near the 10 that was vacant. Nobody was going there for a long time. And they came to us looking for help. Texas was putting money on the table, China was putting money on the table, and we gave them $1 million to help build that out. Well, they bought 150 jobs. Now there's 450 8 months later. I mean, it's one of the fastest growing businesses in the city. And we've worked very closely with them to make sure that they feel like Los Angeles wants them. Because if this is a bet, who knows if they'll be a big car company or not. Their battery technology, I think, will be. But we have to make some bets like this if we're going to ever have a Fortune 500 company come back here, if we're going to be pro-business in the city. And so I will look at that stuff very carefully. I'm not inherently against those loans. When we did Cirque du Soleil in Hollywood, for instance, it turned that parking garage alone, that's been in the red for almost 10 years, into black. Yeah. Well, not now. In the first 4 months of this, the first 4 months of this year, it's already in the black for the year. Because we actually took a stage that was vacant besides the Academy Awards, which did something great for Hollywood, but then it's not a good theater for shows, but Cirque du Soleil needs that kind of verticality. We gave them a $40 million or $45 million loan. I had a lot of criticism about that. I said it's a loan guaranteed by the collateral of this mall, which is worth $1 billion. It's about as safe as you can get in a neighborhood that people think is flashy because there's some good wealth in the hills, but the per capita income was $17,000 per person in the Hollywood area, and we did a local hiring ordinance. And those people can actually work in the neighborhood, not get into a car or get on a bus and cause more traffic. So I will always look at those things, I think, quite carefully.
Metro goes there also.
Sorry?
Metro has a stop.
Yeah, Metro has a stop, yeah.
Okay, so the cities around, we need to move on so we finish all our questions on time. The cities around Los Angeles have taken firmer stance on the quality of life and safety issues than Los Angeles. For example, Culver City refused any at-grade rail crossings in the city and stipulated that any elevated crossings needed to be mitigated to Culver City standards near residential communities. In contrast, the expo trains in Los Angeles will run as close as 30 feet from homes. Will you stand up for Los Angeles residents, or will you follow the policies of Mayor Villaraigosa and put more emphasis on development interests?
Absolutely, I'll stand up for the people of Los Angeles. One of the things I'm most looking forward to is mayors being on the Metro board. I think we need to negotiate tougher. I think we need to make sure that we stand up. I've been very supportive of both Paul and Bill in terms of their attempts to make sure that as the second phase of Expo gets built, that it provides those protections for both residential and school and businesses that are around there. So,
Okay, so
easy.
does that mean that we will not have at-grade crossings at Overland and Westwood?
We will. So, they're pushing hard, obviously, and the Metro board works so that you don't have 100% of the votes. If I'm there as mayor, I think I'm going to have a better ability to influence that, to impact that, but right now I've been on the record and I've been on the record very clearly about it. There's some things we can't unwind, and there's other things that you can count on me that I'm there to be not only a strong voice on, but a better negotiator.
Intuitively, what do you think blocking Overland will do, 24 times an hour will do to West LA traffic?
It will increase it dramatically, which is why I was opposed to it.
And Westwood Boulevard.
It's just
Doesn't-
disaster.
There's gonna be,
It'll be extremely dangerous as well.
and it's what, how many feet from Overland Avenue School? I mean, it's taking a number 1 A-class school, and it's gonna be like my school when I was teaching, we were under the flight pattern of LAX. How do you keep
Would you go to
children?
school?
Okay,
No, I taught school in South Central.
Okay. okay, but let me move on. Do you favor outsourcing of city jobs and responsibilities to private companies?
Private companies, generally not. I think there's public-private partnerships, in certain areas that are not core of what we do. For instance, the convention center maybe could be run better without having city employees and the pension costs and all that stuff. But in general, the privatization I've seen of certain things also leads to less accountability.
Okay. Do you intend to reclassify LAPD sworn positions to civilian jobs?
If there are LAPD sworn folks that are doing civilian jobs, absolutely, we need to expand the civilian positions. And I was the first person, other people will come in here probably running for mayor and say they might have opposed it too. I was the first person to speak out against the layoffs this year that the mayor proposed in his budget because they were civilians in LAPD and would have done the opposite of that, would have even switched more sworn into writing reports. And the police chief was saying this wouldn't affect public safety. And I said, I don't know if you're towing the company line, but I ain't going to do that. And we beat it back and we successfully pushed those layoffs away.
Okay. Do you support the proposed community care facilities ordinance as written?
Speaking of the details, I need to read every last part of it.
That's a good one.
Yes, I need to read every last part of it, and there's some concerns that I have. What I want to make sure, by and large, yes, and I want to make sure that our streets, and I have many of them in my district, so it's very personal, don't have 2 or 3 of these facilities unregulated, no treatment, just money makers in people's backyards. But I also want to make sure that the flaws on making sure that there are, you can't put in for folks that are formerly homeless. Like there's a couple projects I just opened up in my district that would have potentially been prohibited by this, that are taking care of taking people off the street with mental health issues that were homeless, that finally have a shot of not being right in front of your yard in my district and untreated. So I want to make sure that those flaws are addressed, but by and large, I think it's possible.
Okay. What is your view on the prisoner release program?
I think we should be worried and quite scared about the lack of funding that's going towards reintegration and rehabilitation. That we bottomed out in terms of our kind of crime, I think bring the crime level down, and this is going to be something that takes it up if we don't demand from the state that a percentage of our prison dollars go towards rehabilitation.
Okay. What is your view on the Coliseum deal with USC?
I'm in favor of USC running the Coliseum right now. I think it's in good hands with USC, and it's better to take away from this kind of
So who's going to be sitting in the box this time?
Okay.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on the LAX North runway extension toward Northeast?
I think that we need to make sure that the neighborhoods that are around that are protected, that should be first and foremost what we look at. Secondly, though, we need to make sure that the safety of our travelers is addressed. I think that can be done without the aggressive, 2 years ago, the aggressive plan to move it way far north. I think it can be done with a smaller move to the north, even though some of us.
Will you continue the policy of having traffic fines being charged from punishment to budget subsidy? Because what there's been this desire to increase the
I do not want to
fines.
see our parking fines and you're talking about
Like a $25
administrative
ticket
ones.
going to.
Administrative tickets should not be the way of balancing our budget. This year we did do a small increase, but it was not the increase that was proposed. It was reflecting my own values, and I'd like to see that stop.
Okay, the city recently spent $850 million on renovations at LAX and the Tom Bradley Terminal. These renovations were demolished, and now the city is embarking on another $1 billion renovation of this terminal.
It's actually two different buildings. So the renovations did stay in that first round, and there's now a second building being built behind it. So just whoever wrote that, I can get you the information on it, but we need to renovate the terminals for the first time in 30 years. We actually control all the terminals. They were controlled by, in many cases, the airlines themselves, which were all going bankrupt. So the reason that LAX has declined inside the terminals for so long, we've finally been able to assert control, and for the first time in about 3 decades, we control each of those. So absolutely, I'm incredibly passionate about this. I want this airport to sing Los Angeles when you land there, whether it's the food of the great restaurants that we have, whether it's the bands that play in airports like Austin, you land there, and we're the music capital of the world. We should have symphonies or rock bands playing, not symphonies, but quartets perhaps. We should have the art of our cities. We should tell people, we should have an application you can download to your smartphone that says what's going on in LA. We should have a rail link into the airport. If there's one thing I can look back in 10 years from now, or 8, 9 years from now as mayor, I want to say that this is a world-class airport.
Okay.
Marcia?
Yeah.
If I may, what about the express buses? Some time ago, we were down at the commission fighting to maintain
The Westwood one. I'm very supportive.
But what was interesting to me is, I think just prior to that on the agenda, there was a huge multi-million-dollar, not contract, but contract extension, no discussion, no nothing. They approved that, but yet they were fighting over a few $100,000 to try and to maybe sort of keep this going.
I think the airport needs to step up, continue to subsidize that. It's worth every single penny, and we probably don't even need to subsidize it if they market it some, and they'd have better, credit card. You could use it. I mean, there's so many things technologically they haven't put into that Westwood Flyway. And it's the same thing with our buses throughout the city. We need to make it a little sexier to get on a bus. Quicker, more efficient.
Practical. There's no way to deal with your luggage.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting to and from.
There's nobody there. Absolutely. And if you ride the bus right now, all we have is basically benches that keep homeless people from sleeping on them. There's no art. There's no Wi-Fi. There's nothing. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that I think is low-hanging fruit that I would seek to do really quickly, and something that how I live, and would like to bring that kind of ethic to being there.
Okay, so what are your views on the city's efforts to bring wind and solar energy to Los Angeles?
I've been at the forefront of this. I was the first person in 2002. We were about to renew our stake in the Mojave coal plant, which is out of state, so it's very easy for us to say it's somebody else's pollution. And Ron Deaton said, I got this in the bag. I know, Garcetti, you're an environmentalist and you're going to vote against this, but I got this vote. I turned to Alex Padilla and I said, I'm not into this. Are you into this? He said, no. We got together 9 votes and we beat him. And Ron Deaton came up to us and said, how did this happen? I mean, he thought of himself as the 16th council member, and it was the first time the city divested from a coal plant. And we took that money and put it into, among other things, the Pine Tree Wind Farm, which is now the largest municipally owned wind farm in the country, and some of the solar initiatives. I just authored the solar ordinances that, one, allow it easier for you to be able to put solar in your home that will be entitled as a kind of over-the-counter thing instead of going through our bureaucracy, and 2, the feed-in tariff, so that if you're a commercial property owner or own a lot of residential, we will pay you to essentially be a power plant of clean energy here in the city of Los Angeles. We can get there, I think, in terms of, if we're willing to use natural gas, we can bridge in terms of the timetable here. We can bridge probably getting off of coal in the next 15 years. If we don't, it'll probably take more like 25, but I think we can make, in this next decade, double-digit progress.
Gilbert?
I'd like to extend a little bit, embellish a little about the airport.
Sure.
Northeast, North Runway extension.
Yeah.
It appeared to me that you have already bought the idea that, accepted the idea that this is the only solution going northeast extension. I want to remind you that at the beginning, I read all these things from LA Times. I didn't read it to dig into this. However, I have to correct that. I do have a friend in the engineer, high up in the engineering department. So he tells me what is being done, or what would be done, not so much in the policy area. And when the LA Times first reported the need for extension, is the fact that it's a safety issue. Safety issue simply is the two runways are too close, so the big jets coming down landing things here, and makes it as they cross over to the south runway, maybe a little too close, and therefore dangerous stuff would need to be. So I asked this friend of mine, I said, well, it does sound like an orientation issue rather than an extension issue. He said, well, you're right. And then I said to him, I said, why you go northeast? You got to go through all the residential area. Why not go west? He said, there's migrating birds. Oh, I said, the quality of life of birds is more important than the life of taxpayers. And he just shrugged his shoulder. Okay, he shrugged his shoulder. And then I said, seems like you have the present pattern is that you have a stronger emphasis use of both runways. And the two south runways are not being used very extensively. Is it because of the protests launched by residents in the Inglewood area, so they're forcing you to go north? He says, of course, he doesn't know about this issue, but it seems to be there is an even use of the south runway to make this thing here, to make this project more palatable. I noticed that the airport, that big, humongous monstrosity organization like this wants to do something like that. There's nobody will stop it. So the issue is this thing here. So it is okay for environmentalists to stop the project going west. But when the project is done and the neighborhood filed a lawsuit, the airport says, too bad, it's done. What are you going to do about it? So I found it to be very, rather troublesome. So I'm not sure I'm accepting the premise that it's done deal, going northeast.
Okay.
I'd like to comment
Sure, of
on
course.
that. There's a problem with the birds, not in their safety, but the safety of the passengers on the plane. Because you have the birds get into the engines, and the engines fail. And that's a critical issue. It's not an environmental issue, it's a safety issue.
It is an environmental issue, but the environmentalist people never address this kind of thing first. Second thing is that if you take away, so to speak, the migrating pattern, first of all, it's not a major migrating corridor for these birds and things like that. Not that it's suddenly you take away their pit stops and they're just going to fall off the sky, And they will see someplace, and nature take its own course. They will find someplace else to make a pit stop, things like that. So if you just go into the ocean, things like that, or extend something into the ocean, it's not a problem.
So Eric, how will you respond to what Gilbert is saying?
That's the first that I've heard of that proposal. So I try to be a good listener and try to find out more information. If you want to get me anything more, I know some of this.
This article some 2 years ago. I haven't read anything about since. I don't know if it's done deal or not.
I'll check with the airport folks as well. I know the south side is somewhat less underutilized for the big planes because of what airlines have. Terminal 2, for instance, which is an international terminal as well for some of the size of the planes. But other than that, I'm not sure, and I'll find out if that's correct and what we can do. If you want me to follow up with you, I'd be happy to.
Okay, good. As mayor, would you approve a billboard sign ordinance that allows the outdoor advertising companies to place signs in a sign district without a mandatory takedown requirement?
I think not. I mean, I've only supported with a mandatory takedown. Takedowns are very difficult to actually do in practice, but I'm glad that we've had them in Hollywood because it's at least means that we're netting less signage at the end of the day. And I think it's a good model probably citywide, but I know case by case in some parts of the city there's opposition to it and other parts as mayor I'd have to actually listen to more than one part of town about that. I mean, to the people, not the businesses or the
Well, I think consumer people or community people want to take down.
Yeah.
But because the billboard companies want a community betterment or beautification fund, that's what they want.
Yeah, and it depends on which company, because some companies can do the takedowns and some of them have them, all these small ones in residential areas that are really blight and that don't make much money. So they see it as great. The reasons why they're very much for it is they're like, oh, I might get on Wilshire out of this and get out of these crappy little neighborhoods. I can understand from a business perspective why they'd want it. Other places don't have any of those blight ones to take down. But I think in general, if there's some way to pool that together, that's better than a beautification fund.
Or a reduction in size of it.
Yeah, sure.
Or an alternative.
I'd be into that. Absolutely.
Nikki?
Two subjects.
Yes.
One, commercial billboards in the parks.
Yep.
Speak to that.
Yep.
And also, if you could, speak to the Hannah Carter Japanese Gardens UCLA.
Love to see them obviously stay in whatever we can do, whatever role I can play as mayor. I mean, that's that time there as a kid. I enjoyed it very much. The commercial, sorry, the first one was commercial.
There's a proposal to put billboards in parks.
No, I'm opposed to that. That's what I'm opposed to.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Steve?
Thank you very much. Eric, I think you're sensing, obviously, there's incredible frustration. These are deeply committed people, and they talk about the drastic erosion of quality of life. I'm not alive for here, as many are, and it's sad to see how the city has just deteriorated. But the city council, and it's not just on your watch, but a lot of it has happened on your watch, it seems to make mistakes and not learn from them. Here's an example. You talked about in the convention and the AEG deal, you were more excited about what it would do to the convention center, and you mentioned hotels. And yet, the city council and the mayor gave away 14% TOT tax, which is a gigantic amount of tax, which the city desperately needs to provide services, police and fire. And yet AEG says, oh, if you don't give us this rebate, we won't build the Ritz-Carlton and we won't build the Marriott, which they then plaster with billboards and super graphics. And so you can maybe make the nexus that, okay, we got the convention hotel, but then Jim Thomas comes by and says, oh, in the Korean hotel, the Wilshire Grand, I want the same rebate of TOT tax, even though it's not next to the convention center. And God bless him, somebody that we love in Westwood also wants to build a hotel, and now he wants the rebate in Westwood, which has nothing to do with the convention center. And so once you set these precedents, and you let the pigs feed at the trough, one of them sees it, says, well, I want you to give what you gave to him. And so the city, these hotels that should be generating tax revenue are just generators of traffic, and they generate no tax revenue that the city desperately needs. How is the city going to wean itself from these horrifically bad decisions?
And how do you defend your votes on this?
Well, I would defend that, and I'll tell you why. I mean, if you look at, it's not just something that's crept up recently, and I think there's a reason why. If you look at it, when the Bonaventure was built, that was built with a subsidy. The whole point, that was built with a subsidy. If you look at the reasons why those things have been a net gain for us, and we have been penciling this out, we actually have the data on this. The amount that, it's kind of like our city's business tax. We've had, on car dealers, for instance. When I wrote legislation recently to abolish the cities, to basically refund 100% of our city's business tax to any car dealers. We've lost 95 car dealerships in the last 20 years. In sales tax, if we got 5 of them back, we would earn as much as that gross receipts tax would be, which by the way we'd never get because of all the remaining ones that are there. Just 5 hotels are equal to the, I think 5 dozen or so that are still stuck or left in the city. In the hotels as well, we went from 30th to 15th. Our convention center went into the black for the first time in a long, long time because we actually had hotel rooms within walking distance. And if you don't believe that if you think they made out like bandits, I mean, they lost, with those, they missed out on the markets, that's on them. I don't need to cry a tear for them, but AEG lost a tremendous amount of money on building that because of the Ritz-Carlton condominiums. I mean, nobody's barely bought any of them. We talk about this time.
Who wants to buy a condo with billboards on it? Come on.
Well, I think but if it hadn't been for the economic downturn, I mean, things that are happening downtown right now, there's other, you see rents going up. It's just people aren't doing that, not just downtown, but for sale at other places. So when you look at being able to use TOT as a way of putting that back, it has to be done. We have to do the study. We've made sure that our CLA does that every single time with a third-party consultant. It's not anybody from the inside here. It's not somebody working for the industry either. To what is the net economic impact going to be for the rest of the taxes that are there? In Hollywood, when I was able to bring, for instance, Nielsen, which does the ratings for television companies, to headquarter there, they were looking at Glendale and Burbank and Chicago. I could waive their gross receipts tax under a law nobody'd used for entertainment companies in Hollywood. We lost, if you just look at the same way, we lost a tremendous amount of money we would have gotten from the business tax. But guess what? We earned more when cafes popped up, a hotel was built down the street, 500 jobs averaging over $80,000 per job. I really want to stay on this for just a second because we're 166,000 jobs down in the city of LA 20 years after the riot with 800,000 more people. The county of Los Angeles is up in population and up in jobs. There's something sick in the city of LA, and part of that is our taxes. And if that can be used not in some sort of backroom way, but here, and here's the report, it's in the council file, here's the proof afterwards that it's happening, we can be surgical about that TOT. And I think it is one of the best economic development tools we have.
So do you support the live within your means charter amendment?
Jack just wrote me about that. I'm intrigued by it. I want to look a little bit more. I think there's some things that he gets a little bit wrong, but
I want to know, because I
some of the assumptions in it, I think, are maybe a little off. And when we were talking about assumptions, for instance, on how much pension reform, and Jack and I have gone back and forth on this, he measures it in a certain way. He says the city isn't doing it honestly. I think if you do it that way, it's probably an unrealistic projection. But I'm open to looking at it right now. I'm intrigued by it, but I'm nowhere near.
Okay. We need to close up, so we'll take 2 more questions, 3 more questions. Okay, Barbara?
Yes, but finally we're getting into a subject that you don't hear very much about.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you about the concentration of all the city council members on the subject of increasing the tax base. That's a subject that's always on the councilwomen's minds as well. And yet the approach seems to be that the best way and the most efficient way of increasing the tax base is with new development. Development is very important. I'm not anti-development, I'm not anti-business. However, when you consider increases in tax base as profit, you're not also considering what we would call the cost of doing business, which should include a commensurate increase in the development of the infrastructure. So you're considering all of these developments as profit and not improving the infrastructure, which of course we feel the impact from. It's a major cause of concern, and yet you don't talk to the public about the importance of tax base to you and how you calculate it.
Yep.
So what I would like to know is why it is you don't require the developers to at least first or along with development at the same time put money into increasing the infrastructure and improving the infrastructure.
Okay.
I mean, you can put a condition on their development that they never fulfill, and then you don't enforce that condition.
So you don't give them a certificate of occupancy or a certificate of completion until they've paid?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And what I've done, in the area that I've had control over, so you have an idea of how I'd be as mayor. We've had, for instance, we created a transportation fund that's a part of new developments in Hollywood. So that infrastructure is there, and it's decided not by them where it's going to go. Like, we mitigated it this way that we felt, a couple stop signs did it. It's actually used by the folks that are in the council district and specifically the neighborhood where it could be spent. Secondly, when we looked at the crumbling infrastructure that's around us, when you look at sewers, when you look at our storm drains, I've been on a tear on that stuff. I authored Proposition O. It's the largest clean water bond in the nation's history dealing with stormwater because we hadn't dealt with stormwater and the impact of that crumbling infrastructure. And a big part of that is paid for by property owners that are here, in terms of commercial ones that are developing that area.
This doesn't come out of the developer's pocket.
No. That one doesn't, but the previous one does, the transportation, Quimby fees, obviously, and in Hollywood, if those aren't paid up front, we had a couple people coming to us in tough economic times saying, can we pay that afterwards, trust us? I said, no, absolutely not. Like, we have to have these go hand in hand. And I also, to my earlier comments, some development is the infrastructure, and it depends what sort of thing. Some isn't, and a lot of it isn't. And so we have to have a nuanced eye to that, whether it is something that is actually like that building I was mentioning on Sunset Boulevard that's actually creating a park as part of it, because I negotiated that as part of the deal. They can't get it done without building that park because the neighborhood's never had one. But absolutely, I think that's a great idea in terms of actually whether you could have people getting final sign-off before they pay it or not.
But they planning never requires that.
Yeah, but the Quimby money never gets distributed out.
Mine does. You can look at my record. Mine has.
Okay, we have to close up because we only have like 2 minutes left. So Mike, and then Marlena, and then we're done.
Real quick on the last
Sure.
one.
And Eric, can you stay for a few minutes if people have additional
I
questions?
usually can and would. What's my next thing?
visiting someone in the hospital, so.
I can, okay, I can stay for about 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay,
Sorry,
thank
okay.
So, getting to the infrastructure, one of the issues with the Hollywood Community Plan is that there's a development nexus fee that's being considered. The problem is that the city lost a case called Bixel, where you're not allowed to do that. And so it's
For
not a
affordable
valid,
housing stuff, yeah.
it's not a valid mitigation. You can't just build up a giant
Yeah.
fund that's not directly tied to the property. So how,
Well,
How's the mitigation?
I think I don't think it's as easy as that. I think we're going to be on much firmer legal footing because there's plenty of fees that we do attach that have not been thrown out. That one was about inclusionary zoning on affordable housing, correct? The big
no, it was actually for fire hydrants. It was the fire hydrant fund.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, there's 2 or 3 other ones that we have that have been challenged. I mean, Quimby fees have been challenged before. We've had our transportation one challenged, and those have been upheld. So I'm not convinced that we'll lose on that. I guess before we have that, I'll ask the city attorney to walk through some of their reasoning. I mean, Jane Asher's worked very closely with me on a number of these pieces. She's pretty convinced that part I don't think is.
But on the nexus between development and infrastructure,
Yep.
one thing that we've always asked is what is the cost of a given type of development in terms of the infrastructure, so that you can actually measure it. We've never been able to get the city to give us that.
I mean, the most important thing to be able to do if you could develop something like that is to make sure that this gets embedded in land use prices.
Yes.
At the end of the day, if we have this, not to get too far down, but this is the core of the issue. If we just do this stuff and we never change anything about the land use prices never change, nothing will ever get done. We'll get no infrastructure and no good development. I mean, nothing. It'll just be like, and we'll boil like lobsters, 5% more each year. So it won't be a victory. It might be better than what you see as Armageddon, but it'll be like, whatever the opposite of Armageddon is, where everything just crumbles.
When it comes back to enforcement, it's already part of the community plan. Westwood, for instance, says if the density is reached, no new development should come in unless the infrastructure is improved, period. You have to hold up new developents.
And so
It's never
so
done.
it's been successful, or it's not been enforced?
Never enforced. Never enforced. Okay, Marlena has the last question. Can you guys all take off your name tags before you leave so you don't?
Yeah, for next time.
Yeah, okay.
Who
But
am I?
Marlena, you have the
now have
last
no
word.
identity.
I wanted to address the EIR that the Metro just approved, phase 2 and 3. I live on the corner in a high-rise. All the emphasis is being on Century City, Beverly Hills, and the Veterans Administration section. Nothing on the building and the corridor. It's going to be from West Home to West Home. And they just said nothing about it. We're in a methane area, we have streams underneath. I don't know where the faults are. And we're all very nervous about what's going on because they say nothing about it in the EIR.
What's your question?
Question is, somebody should be aware of that, and that should be taken care
I
of.
appreciate that. I'll look at that for the extension of the purple line.
Exactly.
Everybody's been so focused, I think, on Century City.
Exactly,
That's been
they get everything and nobody's paying attention
Thank you
to
for
us.
letting me know
We've
about
got
that.
23-story buildings.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, guys.
We're a tough group.
I appreciate that you're tough, and I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the accountability. I really do.